Hello and welcome back to the Electronic Intifada's live stream for Wednesday, June 12th. Thank you for tuning in. I'm Nora Barrows-Friedman with my colleagues Ali Abunimah, Jon Elmer, Asa Winstanley, and Tamara Nassar. It's day 250 of Israel's genocide in Gaza. Coming up in this broadcast, we'll have a discussion with our colleague Omar Karmi on the latest political developments. And of course, Jon Elmer will cover the resistance throughout the Gaza Strip from Rafah to Beit Hanoun. And Ali Abunimah will also have a segment on debunking the latest so-called mass rapes hoax. And I wanted to let our viewers know that Tamara has recorded a tutorial for turning on live captioning during this live stream. You can find a link to that in the description below. But first, some of the news of Israeli attacks on Gaza between June 6th and June 12th. On Saturday, June 8th at 11 in the morning, as families and children were in the busy market in the densely populated Nuseirat refugee camp, Israeli warplanes and attack helicopters started circling overhead while Israeli special forces, using civilian vehicles, invaded the camp. According to eyewitness reports and documentation by human rights groups, the special forces raided 2 homes inside the camp, followed by attacks by Israeli tanks and quadcopters on 3 separate areas of the camp.
اصبر ايش في وحده خاصه كنه امي يا الله امي اصبر اقعد في كم صاروخ هيا طيار هي كواد كابتر هيها
Al-Mazan Center for Human Rights states that, quote, the ground assault coincided with Israeli warplanes directly striking 5 homes in the camp while their residents were still inside and intensively conducting airstrikes and fire belts in those 3 areas. Al-Mazan states, quote, the ground attack combined with the special units' infiltration and relentless bombardment took place when Nuseirat camp's market was overcrowded with thousands of shoppers. It is important to note that Nuseirat shelters tens of thousands of forcibly displaced Palestinians from the eastern middle area and Rafah. The Israeli army announced that the attack was launched in order to release 4 Israeli captives who were taken at the Supernova Music Festival on October 7th. 274 Palestinians, including 64 children, were killed in the attack, which lasted around 75 minutes. According to initial information, Al-Mazan says that the overwhelming majority of those killed were targeted while at home or on the streets, with some being killed as they were trying to flee the Israeli attacks from the camouflaged civilian vehicles. Nearly 700 were wounded, including 153 children. Ambulance and rescue teams struggled to evacuate killed and injured Palestinians, many of whom had been shredded to pieces or decapitated by the bombing, the human rights groups report. Quote, this attack further proves Israel's dehumanization of Palestinians and blatant disregard for Palestinian life. The sheer scale of Palestinians killed and injured underscores a deliberate and callous indifference to Palestinian suffering, further emphasizing a systematic policy that views Palestinian lives as expendable, Al-Mazan stated. Al Jazeera Arabic documented testimonies of Palestinians who survived the massacre and attacks, and I will speak the subtitles for you in this next video. Vehicles with Palestinian number plates came as if they were bringing aid. All we got were soldiers and special forces in an area filled with displaced people. One person said, these are not Arabs, they're Jews.
مش عرب هذول يهود بعدين صار رمز قنبله بعدين صار اشتباكات بعدين كمان قنبله
Their bomb and then an F-16.
يا رب يا رب الله أكبر يا رب.
The plane was bombing houses of Muslims. They struck with many rockets. Within 10 minutes, they were at the entrance of our home and our neighbor next to us. They told me to confess or they would detain and shoot my kids. I said, I don't know anything. I don't know the resistance or have any weapons. Within a minute, in the other room, I hear the sound of gunfire. And at that moment, my 2 sons were shot. My 12-year-old was killed. My other son is here. May God heal him. There are more than 14 people that are still people under the rubble. The streets are filled with bodies. He is the only one that survived, he and his mother. The rest are gone. That was from Al Jazeera. Our contributor Ruwaida Amr spoke to several eyewitnesses and survivors of the Nusayrat massacre. She writes that, quote, around 11 a.m., Ahmed Labad heard the sound of missiles falling one after the other. It was terrifying, he said. I hugged my children and screamed that we had to leave the house and take shelter in a school. As they left their home, we saw missiles exploding around us, he added. People were screaming and calling for an ambulance, he said. I did not look back or around me. Ahmed carried his children as they were too afraid to walk. It was only after 2 hours of extreme violence that Ahmed and his family could go back home. Many of my neighbors lost members of their family, he said. I cannot forget those moments, and I cannot believe that I saved my children from this terrible massacre. That was from Ruwaida Amr's feature, There Was Blood Everywhere. Israeli jets and helicopter gunships also struck areas in nearby Deir al-Balah at the same time on Saturday. In Deir al-Balah, our contributor Abu Bakr Abed reported, quote, I opened my phone and started to film the attacks. A blast occurred nearby and it felt like my eardrums had been pierced. A building mere meters away had been targeted. Another airstrike destroyed a house in our area. Missiles kept falling around us. We could see US-made Apache helicopters being flown low in the sky. From them, Israeli troops were shooting at civilians in the streets. Abu Bakr adds that, quote, I had a quick look out the window and saw people being displaced. Exhausted mothers carried their infants, children dragged bags containing a few belongings, older people coughed. Women wearing their prayer dresses implored God to protect everyone. The traffic seemed to be more chaotic than it had ever been. Cars and other vehicles carried hundreds of people who were seeking refuge, even though nowhere in Gaza is safe. Amid the chaos, it was difficult for ambulances to reach places that had been targeted and bring injured people to hospital. We live near Al-Aqsa Martyrs Hospital in Deir al-Balah. I could hear people in that hospital screaming in grief and pain. A moment later, there were another couple of airstrikes toward the west. We panicked even more. We were ready for death. We expected that it would be our last day. I couldn't stand on my feet. We stayed close to each other in one room, hoping that this horror would end. Before I died, I felt I should have a look at my yellow rose. I water it every single day. I went to the balcony. It seemed the end was near. That was from Abu Bakr Abed's piece, Panic in Central Gaza. Abu Ubaida, the spokesperson for the Qassam Brigades, the armed wing of Hamas, said that some Israeli captives were killed during the operation. Our colleague Maureen Claire Murphy wrote that Israel has so far not reported any fatalities among the captives during the raid. Abu Ubaida said, quote, by committing horrifying massacres, the enemy was able to liberate a few of its prisoners, but at the same time, it killed some of them during the operation. The operation will constitute a major danger to the enemy's prisoners and will have a negative impact on their conditions and their lives, he added. Maureen added, quote, Israel has repeatedly accused Hamas of hiding among civilians to justify its targeting and destruction of civilian infrastructure, including hospitals, in Gaza, while apparently using trucks disguised as humanitarian aid to carry out an operation that killed scores of civilians. Feigning civilian or non-combatant status, as Israeli forces appear to have done, and hardly for the first time, may constitute the war crime of perfidy under international humanitarian law, Maureen notes. The Israeli army habitually uses the tactic of disguising its soldiers as civilians in order to carry out extrajudicial assassinations and deadly raids, especially in the occupied West Bank. American intelligence units provided intelligence to the Israeli army for the Nuseirat operation. U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan stated on the day of the raid and massacre that, quote, "The United States is supporting all efforts to secure the release of hostages still held by Hamas, including American citizens. This includes through ongoing negotiations or other means." The United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres stated at an international conference in Jordan on Tuesday that it was, quote, "high time for a ceasefire along with the unconditional release of the remaining Israeli captives." But he made no mention whatsoever of the thousands of Palestinian hostages, many held for years without charge or trial, and many being systematically tortured in various Israeli prisons and concentration camps. For much more on Saturday's massacre in Nuseirat, read our reports by Maureen Claire Murphy, Rueda Amar, and Abu Bakr Abed on electronicintifada.net. And we'll have more details on the Israeli operation with John later on in the program, especially in terms of how the Israeli forces used the Netzarim corridor to carry out the raid using tanks and civilian vehicles. 2 days before Saturday's Nuseirat massacre that killed 274 and injured 700, Israeli forces bombed a United Nations school sheltering nearly 6,000 people inside the Nuseirat refugee camp, killing at least 40, including 14 children. Maureen Claire Murphy writes, quote, 3 prominent Palestinian human rights groups said that at least 4 missiles struck the southern building of the school in Nuseirat refugee camp. The Israeli-fired weapons, quote, directly penetrated the roof of the second and first floors, causing damage to several classrooms and leading to almost total destruction of the 3-story building and destroying water tanks. Both the Washington Post and CNN reported that U.S.-supplied weapons were used in the deadly attack, which survivors said occurred without warning, Maureen adds. CNN stated that it had identified fragments, quote, of at least 2 U.S.-made GBU-39 small-diameter bombs in video filmed at the scene by a journalist working for CNN. The Washington Post analyzed verified footage recorded by an eyewitness that it said shows the distinctive nose cone of a GBU-39 bomb. Peter Lerner, the Israeli military's chief English language spokesperson, admitted that the deadly attack in Nuseirat was the 5th time in the last month that it had struck UN facilities on the pretext that they were being used as bases by Palestinian armed groups. At least 450 displaced people have been killed while sheltering in UN facilities since October 7th, according to UNRWA, the UN Agency for Palestine Refugees. Meanwhile, Maureen notes, Israel has previously lied about civilian infrastructure such as hospitals being used as military bases by Palestinian armed groups in an attempt to justify the attacks. And of course, Israel has turned UN schools and hospitals in Gaza into military barracks from which they may have conducted attacks on Palestinians. Our contributor Khulud Rabah Suleiman also reported on the bombing of the UN school in Nuseirat. She writes that a man she spoke with, Ahmed Hassanein, spent hours digging in the rubble trying to rescue people. Some of the scenes he witnessed were especially gruesome, she writes. Quote, he saw a boy gathering his sister's flesh before burying it in a pile of sand in the schoolyard. He saw an injured man tearing his clothes to pieces as he grieved for his family, most of whom had been killed. He saw a girl sitting in a corridor at the school, trembling in fear and with blood streaming down her leg. Ahmed asked her about her family. "I don't know where they are," the girl replied. "I don't know if they are still alive." Ahmed was speechless. He then took the girl to hospital. "I still cannot get these scenes out of my head," Ahmed said. "I sometimes have flashbacks." For much more, read Khalud Rabah Suleiman's feature, Slaughter in a School, and Maureen Claire Murphy's report, Israeli Bombing Kills Dozens Sheltering at UN School, on electronicintifada.net. Israeli airstrikes continued to target areas across Gaza over the last few days, including in Burej and Maghazi refugee camps in the central areas. On Tuesday, Palestinians captured this video of Israeli jets striking tents of displaced people on the beach in the Al-Zuwaydah area in central Gaza.
Ya Allah, Ya Allah, Ya Allah, Ya Allah, Ya Rab, Ya Rab.
Palestinian health officials say that since the beginning of June, more than 800 people have been killed and more than 2,400 wounded in Israeli bombings, raids, and ground offensives across Gaza. Bryce DeLevine, head of the Doctors Without Borders Médecins Sans Frontières emergency unit, stated this week that, quote, "Since October and certainly before, the dehumanization of Palestinians has been a hallmark of this war. Catch-all phrases like 'war is ugly' act as blinders to the fact that children too young to walk are being dismembered, eviscerated, and killed." Doctors Without Borders said that, quote, "These attacks are the latest in a broad litany of atrocities and illustrate the type of war that Israel is fighting. Israel and its allies have repeatedly shown that there is no watershed moment or red line in this violence. The attacks, now known as the Flower Massacre, the Tent Massacre, or the killing of aid workers and their families, or the annihilation of hospitals and the health system more generally, have led to no more than weak diplomatic posturing, empty words, and staggering inaction." According to new statistics from the United Nations Satellite Imagery and Analysis Agency, 55% of all buildings in the Gaza Strip have been destroyed by the Israeli military. The Palestinian Central Bureau of Statistics warned that the accumulation of, quote, "mountains of waste and rubble in Gaza is posing significant health and environmental risks," in a statement for World Environment Day on June 5th. The Bureau added that the last 8 months of Israel's genocide and, quote, "excessive, indiscriminate destruction of the Palestinians and their resources has had a disastrous effect on all aspects of life in Gaza." Quote, "Dumping thousands of tons of explosive and toxic materials causes significant pollution of soil, water, and air, which negatively affects ecosystems and public health and exposes them to threats. In addition, the destruction of environment facilities such as wastewater treatment plants and desalination plants impedes the community's ability to withstand and manage water resources, which exacerbates the risk of drought and the shortage of clean and potable water." The Palestinian Bureau of Statistics added that, quote, "The United Nations Development Program estimates that at least 270,000 tons of waste, 170,000 tons in the south and 100,000 tons in the north, have accumulated in temporary landfill sites recently that established by municipalities in close proximity to residential areas due to the lack of viable options. However, these wastes have no way to sanitary landfills except by burning or accumulation. The Gaza municipality, which, as we showed you last week, has been organizing ad hoc community efforts to clear as much rubble and debris as possible, reports that its crews have been collecting and transporting garbage and other waste to the eastern part of Gaza City. It said that along with the lack of fuel necessary to collect waste, the occupation's destruction of vehicles, and the occupation's prevention of municipal crews from reaching the main landfill east of the city, large quantities of waste has been left to accumulate in the streets. The Geneva-based Euromed Human Rights Monitor stated this week that the Israeli army's destruction of hospitals and medical facilities in northern Gaza and the complete shutdown of the remaining partially operational ones amounts to a decision for mass execution of patients. Quote, "With the shutdown of these hospitals, all medical facilities in northern Gaza are now out of service. There are no places left to treat the wounded or sick. Maternal and child health programs are completely halted, Euromed added. Following the 2 massacres in Nuseirat refugee camp this past week, doctors and medical staff at the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Hospital in nearby Deir Balah in central Gaza say that the hospital has been functioning on just 1 remaining generator, and if it breaks down, the medical facility would be forced to close. The health ministry in Gaza said that the hospital generators are breaking down because of the blockade preventing fuel, of course, but also preventing the spare parts to repair them. On June 10th, the ministry warned that the only oxygen station in the Gaza Governorate, which supplies health facilities and chronically ill patients with oxygen, could stop functioning due to the shortage of fuel. And finally, we wanted to bring you some images and videos from journalists and others in Gaza who are not just relentlessly documenting the unspeakable atrocities, but also making sure to highlight the resilience, joy, and determination of the Palestinian people. Abdulaziz Mohammed, a volunteer with the Palestine Red Crescent Society's ambulance crews, took a selfie with his colleagues in their ambulance this week and posted it to Twitter with the caption, "The voice of truth is much stronger than the sound of the weapon." Physicians and medical staff at the Al-Ahli Baptist Hospital in Gaza City posed for a photo to commemorate obtaining brand new scrubs this week. A massive crowd gathered in central Gaza to help free a bird that became entangled in wires.
مع الوضع صعب عندنا بغزة ففي عصفور قرر ينتحر. العصفور حاليا طالع على سلك الكهرباء وقاعدين نحاول الناس. العصفور بده ينتحر بس احنا مش هنسمح له. طلع قديش في ناس كل هدول الناس جايين ينقذوا العصفور. ضحى بحاله بس عشان ينزل العصفور. لو قاس الكهرباء هلقيت بصير عند ربنا.
And award-winning journalist Maha Husseini posted this photo of kids she met who had just finished a lesson with their teacher in a shelter. Maha, who has been on this live stream before, won a 2024 Courage in Journalism Award from the International Women's Media Foundation on Monday. Mabruk from all of us at the Electronic Intifada, Maha. And that's it for the news roundup. As always, go to electronicintifada.net for much more, especially to read our new features by our phenomenal and brave writers in Gaza. You're watching the Electronic Intifada live stream. I'm Nora Barrows-Friedman with my colleague Ali Abunimah. Hi, Ali.
Hi, Nora. Thank you again for that extraordinary report. So much heartache, so much suffering, so much resilience. And it's hard to believe it's been 250 days.
It seems impossible. I mean, I have no words. It's really impossible to understand the gravity of this. I don't know what to say. It's just horror upon horror, and it's relentless. And this past week, I mean, the 2 successive massacres in Nuseirat.
And I think was it Doctors Without Borders who you quoted in the report? The words that really stuck with me: no watershed moment. In other words, I think many of us thought, okay, there'll be a point where they say enough is enough. The Americans will pull the plug and end their genocide, their Israeli-American genocide. But what we're learning is there's no limit. They won't stop it unless they're forced to stop it by the resistance and by global solidarity and outrage and protest.
That's it. Yeah, no red lines, as we've said, as plenty of people have said over the last few months. Well, Ali, we have a packed show. Of course, we're going to get a full update from Jon Elmer later on in the show, and you have a segment that we're going to get into. But first, we're going to bring on our colleague, Omar Karmi, of the Electronic Intifada. Hi, Omar.
Hi there, Nora. Thanks for having me.
Hi, Omar.
Thanks for being
Hi,
here.
Ali.
So we wanted to have you on to talk about kind of political and regional developments. There's a lot going on with the UN Security Council resolution and and all sorts of diplomatic machinations. The U.S. once again putting the onus on Hamas, even though Hamas has said that it supports the resolution for a ceasefire. Can you talk about what you've been looking at and the failure of what the U.S. purports are its diplomatic efforts to achieve a ceasefire?
So the ceasefire proposal, which was accepted by the UN Security Council yesterday, is interesting for a number of reasons. But it might be useful if I just go through what it actually is. Yeah. So this is supposed to be a 3-phase ceasefire, where in the first phase there's a ceasefire. There would be a hostage exchange. The Israeli military would redeploy from populated areas of Gaza and allow the unfettered access of humanitarian aid. That is supposed to be a 6-week period before a second phase, which would lead to a permanent ceasefire, the withdrawal of Israeli military from every area of Gaza, and the final exchange of hostages, which would then lead to a third phase, which would be a multi-year, is what they put it. In fact, the UN has estimated that to rebuild Gaza could take as long as 80 years after all this destruction. Anyway, a multi-year reconstruction phase, international reconstruction phase. Now, what's interesting about the proposal, well, several things are interesting about the proposal, but first of all, there's no talk in there of a total victory, which is, of course, why everybody is really waiting, not so much for Hamas's response. Hamas has welcomed it. They have details to iron out, which is entirely natural. But everybody is really waiting for an official response from Israel. Now, the US has presented this as an Israeli proposal. It's very similar to the proposal early May, ahead of Israel's Rafah invasion, which Hamas also accepted, but which about which Netanyahu, Prime Minister of Israel, basically said, with or without a deal, we are still going for total victory. And of course, what happened was there was no deal. Israel invaded Rafah, despite US opposition to an invasion of Rafah, and has wreaked untold damage, as you saw in the report, ever since. In fact, Médecins Sans Frontières, that you quoted there, say that since the 1st of June, that is what, 12 days? 800 people have been killed in Gaza. So clearly, whatever efforts the US had, whatever thoughts they had about we're opposed to a Rafah invasion, it is clear that, as you said before, the US has set no red lines for Israel. Or if it has set red lines for Israel, Israel isn't listening, simply. So I think what's interesting about this ceasefire proposal is that it meets many of the core demands of Hamas: full withdrawal, exchange of prisoners, and of course a permanent ceasefire, which I think is important, and which is why, of course, Hamas have welcomed it. It needs a lot of details. The first phase is supposed to last 6 weeks. Crucially, and this is also important, the proposal stipulates that even if negotiations for a hostage exchange exceeds those 6 weeks, the ceasefire should continue. So that's also important. It is, in effect, a call for a permanent ceasefire.
But Omar, if I may, it's on that. I listened, for example, to the statements, media interviews with various members of the Hamas political bureau in recent days. And yesterday, actually, since the Security Council passed this resolution, for example, Osama Hamdan said exactly, in effect, what you say. We welcome these ideas. We responded positively. But for us, we won't accept any fudge about a permanent ceasefire, because it seems to be that for Hamas is they want it with no ambiguity, no negotiations about extending the ceasefire. The ceasefire is going to be permanent. But what I want to ask you about, it just seems so odd to me that Hamas has now come out and welcomed this proposal in one form or another on May 6th, when the Americans transmitted it to Hamas through the Qatari and Egyptian mediators, an American-approved proposal. And then again, following the Security Council resolution yesterday, they came up, they said, we welcome this. We've got a few comments, particularly this issue of the permanent ceasefire and end to this genocide. The Americans insist that this is an Israeli proposal and Israel has already accepted it. But the Israelis beg to differ. There has still been no statement from the Israeli Prime Minister saying, yes, this is our proposal and we accept it and we're committed to it. And on the contrary, there have been multiple statements from Israeli leaders saying, we will never agree to a permanent ceasefire, we'll never end the war, we disagree with this proposal. Antony Blinken was in Doha, Qatar today. He gave a press conference with the Qatari Prime Minister, where again, he insisted, against everything we can all, see or hear or read, that he insisted that Israel accepts this and Hamas rejects it, when in fact, the truth we can all see is the opposite. How do you explain this, Omar?
Well, I mean, it's hard to explain with any rational sort of logic, because U.S. diplomacy has been, well, I call it incompetent in one of my recent articles. I think that might be a fairly positive spin on it. But basically, this is what it is. U.S. diplomacy is entirely based on not looking to pressure Israel. Now, this whole selling it as an Israeli ceasefire proposal is very interesting, because actually, as I say, it is there are a number of points in there that Israel, up until, well, today, basically, just doesn't agree with. Israel has insisted from the beginning it wants what it calls total victory, which is a complete elimination of Hamas, and which obviously is impossible to achieve. So they've set themselves an impossible target, in part to set themselves up for a continuous war, continuous assault. And this is what they've done so far. There's nothing that has changed in the month that you talk about since the last ceasefire proposal to this one, diplomatically anyway, from the Israelis anyway, that would suggest that the Israelis would suddenly turn around and go, no, we don't want total victory now. We're happy where we got to, and this is where we can end it. So it is clear to me that this is not an Israeli ceasefire proposal. Or if it is an Israeli ceasefire proposal, it's from elements in Israel that don't seem to be represented by the government. Perhaps this has something to do with Gantz and Benny Gantz's resignation. Maybe this came from him. It may be that there is an attempt basically by the US to engineer some kind of a power shift in Israel. But it seems highly unlikely that this emanates from Israel. This is an American proposal, and it's the same, or pretty much the same proposal as it was last time. So the public spin that the US is giving it, which is to say that it's up to Hamas, the ball is in Hamas's court, all of this stuff, is basically the US trying to give itself a way out, and yet again, not blame Israel, which is what the US diplomatic efforts seem to have been entirely focused on for the past 8 months, not to blame Israel.
In your op-ed piece that you wrote last week, which people should read, Rudderless, Incompetent, and Complicit, you talk about how Washington's, commitment to constantly moving its own goalposts is not a good look for a superpower, you say, because it makes it look feckless. Can you talk about moving the goalposts in terms of also the U.S.'s kind of speaking out of both sides of its mouth in terms of international legal obligations and international humanitarian rights law, in order to protect Israel, in order to create a narrative where Israel is absolutely abiding by international law, whereas the Palestinians are not, even though, time and time, the ICC and the ICJ have said that Israel's actions in Gaza constitute genocidal acts. Can you talk about the U.S.? Like, what does this mean in terms of the legitimacy of international law and international human rights law after this? What does it mean for any of it?
Well, I think, I think the incompetence part of this is very much U.S. diplomacy over these entire, because U.S. public diplomacy from December has been to urge Israel to calm down. We expect Israel to wind down its operation. We expect Israel to allow humanitarian aid. We don't accept a buffer zone in Gaza. We don't accept a Rafah invasion. I mean, constantly public diplomacy, American public diplomacy, has been to say certain things that Israel has almost immediately defied. So from public diplomacy perspective, it's been a complete failure from the Americans. And more than a failure, it's been an embarrassment. I mean, if you're a superpower, in March, just ahead of Ramadan, the UN Security Council adopted a resolution calling for an immediate ceasefire, and the US abstained. Now, normally, this is a very serious signal, diplomatic signal, that this is what the US wants, particularly when it comes to Israel, where it normally vetoes. Totally ignored. Just last month, with the ceasefire that we were just talking, the former ceasefire proposal we were just talking about, the US was clear that Rafah was a red line. Well, it wasn't a red line, because immediately Israel went into Rafah. Then they tried to dissemble, and you heard Sullivan, who was on the picture there of the article, talk about, well, we believe it's still a limited operation, but we have conveyed our clear position, or the president's clear position, to Israel. And when he was asked about what that clear position was, he literally said, there's no mathematical formula. It depends on if there is a lot of death and destruction. Well, this came a day before Israel bombed a tent encampment in Rafah, killing 46 people. That clearly, this came a day after that, and that clearly didn't meet this non-mathematical formula for a lot of death and destruction. So basically, there are no red lines. But what the US is doing by coming up with these statements is it's looking impotent. It is looking as if it has lost control. Either it is telling Israel one thing behind closed doors and then saying something in public, but even if it's doing that, it's looking incompetent. It's looking powerless. It's looking weak. And for a superpower, for the US, which has maintained sort of overall hegemony in the Middle East for decades, it's a very poor look.
Well, Omar, let's talk more about that, because I think, speaking for myself personally, and I think many people across the region, the weaker the United States is in the region, the better. The sooner it gets out, the better. The United States has caused nothing but chaos and destruction for decades. We could talk about Iraq, Syria, Libya. Of course, it's decades of support for Israeli savagery and barbarism and occupation, apartheid. And now, of course, it's unlimited, no red lines support for genocide. The US, to put it bluntly, is a force of evil in the region. So the weaker, the better. That's how a lot of people see it. And I don't disagree with that at all. But of course, so I don't care if the US looks weak. I want the US to be weak. I don't care about the interests of the genocidal psychopaths in Washington. But this weakness, this image of weakness or impotence, as you put it, does have consequences in the sense that, the main attraction of the United States for regimes in the region is that the US is a protector. The US is a guarantor of stability. Talk about that. The weakening of the United States, both in terms of perception and in reality, and the increase in the influence and strength of China, the fact that China brings actual development and infrastructure and trade and diplomacy. What impact is that having even on the closest clients or vassals of the United States in the region? And how does that relate to what's happening in Palestine?
Well, so there's a lot in there, but I think the weakening of the US role in the region, in particular, and in general in the world, has been, a gradual process which has been taking place. Much has to do with the rise of China as an economic power and as a trading, as a technological giant. But I think what has happened over the last 9 months is because of the incompetent handling of Israel. This process is accelerating really quickly. I mean, I think the US has been aware that its role as atop a unipolar world was coming to an end. Back in 2017, the Department of Defense released this very detailed report talking about warfare in the future and how the US had to readjust to a multipolar world. So, this has been clearly been in the cards for a while. We know that China's economy is set to overtake America's anywhere between 5 and 30 years. Most people agree that that is an inevitability. But combined with diplomacy, Israel used to be seen as a projection of US strength in the Middle East. Today, with the way they've handled everything, in addition to, of course, the fact that what they're handling is a genocide. I mean, this is not merely about politics. This is an actual genocide, and people across the region are looking at this, and whatever their feelings might have been before or after, this is a genocide, and the US is supporting it, and it's clear as day. So in addition to sort of other economic and diplomatic and political factors, the fact that the US has stood so steadfastly by Israel while it's committing a genocide is accelerating a process of people saying, what are our options? And with the public diplomacy I was talking about, rather than looking as a projection of strength in the region, Israel is now looking as a projection of weakness, of US weakness in the region. If it's unable to hold Israel to international law, if it's prepared to set aside international law for its ally, but not only international law, even its own laws. I mean, the US has very strict rules for weapons exports, the Leahy law. And Israel has been allowed to breach these rules. Even Patrick Leahy himself wrote a piece in the Washington Post last month, I think, saying that at least some Israeli military units are in breach of that law and should be sanctioned. So, having failed to get its ally in line, even though it's been saying that it wanted, like I said before, it has on numerous occasions said a number of things that it wanted Israel to do, and Israel has completely ignored it. So it's looking weak. And as a result of that, countries of the region are looking elsewhere. They were already looking elsewhere. I mean, China is the biggest trading partner of both Saudi Arabia and Iran, interestingly. In fact, China brokered the reestablishment of diplomatic ties between Saudi Arabia and Iran in 2020. It has invested more than $120 billion in Iraq, in Iran, in Saudi Arabia, and the UAE. And the UAE is really interesting in this respect, because the UAE, which signed this Abraham Accord, normalizing relations with Israel. There are many reasons why the UAE did this, but one of the things that it was promised as a result of this accord was the delivery of F-35 fighter jets from the US. Now we are 4 years down the line, maybe 5 years down the line. Those jets have not been forthcoming, and the UAE are now sourcing their military hardware from China. So when you put your eggs in a basket of a superpower, and let's not forget the Iran deal. I mean, the Iran deal was brokered by one administration and torn up by the next. So if you have an administration that presents itself as a force for good, a force for stability, a force for development, and yet you cannot rely on it to stick to its agreements, and you cannot rely on it to stick to its own laws, let alone international law, then the natural reaction will be to turn elsewhere. And for many decades, there was no elsewhere to turn to for the countries of the region. But that's changed. There's China. So China is really growing in its influence, frankly, merely by the fact of not being the US. I mean, it doesn't really have to do much, but it is doing more as well. It's even hosted Palestinian unity talks recently in May, which unsurprisingly have not led anywhere yet, but China is playing a bigger and a bigger role. And I think what we're seeing now with this quite irrational and immoral support for genocide in Palestine is the beginning of the end of American dominance in the Middle East.
So, Omar, one other thing on that. I mean, one of the Biden administration still keeps talking about a Saudi-Israeli normalization deal as a way, sort of as a prize that's going to get Israel, that it's going to win for Israel if Israel agrees to this proposal, whatever it is, and that's going to be the path for, stability, prosperity, and apple pie across the region. I mean, and at certain moments, it's appeared, at least, in terms of the media spin, that normalization deal is on the verge of happening. And that was supposed to be sort of the cherry on the cake of the Abraham Accords, where Israel normalized with the UAE, the Emirates, Bahrain, Morocco, and a couple of, I can't remember them all, the sort of smaller client states. Is it going to happen? And is it of any value either to Israel or the Saudis, or are these just delusions in Washington or media spin?
Well, I mean, it's a good question. I would say that before October 7, it was in the cards. I mean, it still seemed to me that I didn't quite understand what was in it for Saudi Arabia. I mean, don't forget, Saudi Arabia came up with a 2003 Arab Peace Initiative, 2002 maybe, which was basically offering Israel complete normalization and peace with the entire Arab world in return for a Palestinian state, 67 borders, and just a resolution to the refugee issue. That has been completely ignored, right? And so for Saudi Arabia to sign on to a normalization deal with Israel without any of this happening was always going to be a big ask. Now, since, of course, Israel began its genocide in Gaza, this has been even more unlikely. And while there have been two attempts, one by Blinken, one by Sullivan, And both those attempts, this in the last 2 months, to reestablish this deal, both those attempts were followed by sort of headlines that seemed to suggest that a deal was incredibly close. In fact, I'd suggest the deal is further away than ever, because and for the same reason that U.S. diplomacy is foundering elsewhere. The Saudis want what they wanted in the Arab Peace Initiative, which is a credible pathway to a Palestinian state. The Israelis are completely opposed and unwilling or unable to push Israel to do anything. The US has had to drop it. And that is central. And now, of course, Saudi Arabia doesn't need the US. One of the aims of this deal was precisely to steer Saudi Arabia away from China. I mean, that's been openly admitted. And there seems to be no reason for Saudi Arabia to want to be steered away from China, its biggest trading partner at this moment in time, for absolutely no gain, other than military hardware, of course, and AI technology, I believe.
Right.
All of which are now readily available from other
Absolutely.
Right.
And by the way, when you say that the Chinese economy is set to overtake the US, by some estimates I've read, it's already overtaken the US in terms of purchasing power, and by other indicators, just a few years ago, basic, fundamental research and technology was far higher in the United States, and now that's shifted. Basic scientific and technological research and innovation is now taking off in China. So the engines of Chinese development and growth are just, off the charts. And so I think I agree with one thing you say, Omar, which is that all this is happening at an accelerated pace, and it's sort of hard to grasp it all fully.
Absolutely. And I mean, look, beyond the regional politics, what credibility does Washington have anymore if it goes to lecture other people, particularly Saudi Arabia? Let's not forget that the Biden administration wanted to treat Saudi Arabia as a rogue state for the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. And who's going to listen to Washington talk about human rights now, after its wholesale support for what Israel has been doing? I mean,
Yeah.
So this is the incompetence part. I mean, the US has just put itself in a situation where it just has no credibility.
And I don't want to let Europe off the hook. So, Omar, as someone in the adjacent belly of the beast in the UK, what does it mean for European politics and kind of, and Western hegemony, as Ali was talking about, in general, in terms of the loss of whatever, assumed credibility, that the West, Europe, and North America have enjoyed for so long, in how that credibility is tanking everywhere.
Well, I mean, I think everybody suffers from this problem. I mean, this sort of I don't want to say blind. I'm not. This devotion to Israel that the West seems to have, which transgresses law or rationality or anything, is clearly exacting a very steep cost for European and American diplomacy, Western diplomacy in general, and credibility. Europe will be as much a victim, perhaps less so. I mean, it might be seen as slightly less complicit, only because it's not such a big, they don't, fund Israel to the tune of 3.8 billion every year. So, it might have slightly less of an impact, but a lot of countries in Europe, the UK, I just wrote a piece about Denmark, where I had a foreign minister who basically said that even if charges of war crimes are substantial against Israel, they'll still continue selling arms. I mean, these are countries who are openly rejecting international law that they themselves are so keen to impose on others.
Right.
So it will have a similar, maybe slightly less. I mean, Europe's role in the region remains mostly on trade rather than military, and that might save it a little bit more than the US. But yes, it's going to have an impact everywhere. I can't see any other outcome of this.
Yeah. Well, we just have a few minutes left. Ali, did you have a follow-up?
Yeah, I think that I'd like to ask Omar about this is something Omar's written about quite a lot, and maybe it's something we need to come back for a longer discussion since we only have a short time now. But Palestinian politics, there's been this so-called split. You mentioned China hosting talks, and you said it's no surprise that they haven't reached any reconciliation between Hamas on the one hand, for example, and Fatah, the faction led by Palestinian Authority leader Mahmoud Abbas. It's no surprise to me either, because on the one hand, Fatah is fighting this existential war, leading the resistance against a genocidal regime, while Mahmoud Abbas is sitting in Ramallah under the protection of Israeli occupation forces and totally dependent on financial transfers from the occupation to keep his authority going. And that's been the dynamic for a number of years since Hamas won the Palestinian legislative elections in 2006. But I just want to ask you about that, because Abbas and the PA still seem to be the darlings of the West, of the United States, the European Union, the great hope. And what is never discussed is sort of how Palestinians view the PA. And so I want to ask you about that. Does the PA have any relevance or any future, or is it on its last legs?
Well, it has relevance in the sense that, it keeps a very large security force in the West Bank, which acts, as we've seen in the past, with great brutality against its own people. So from that perspective, it has relevance. It's also one of the biggest, if not the biggest employer in the West Bank. And that is, of course, very important in an occupied territory that doesn't have the ability to develop its own economy because of the occupation. In terms of credibility with its own people, it has barely any. I mean, I think the last opinion poll I saw, Abbas would have lost to any and all candidates, plausible candidates that he might have gone against, even from his own party. He has his approval ratings have hovered in the single figures up to the low teens for years, and because in the West Bank, it is clear to people that his strategy, if you can call it that, which is of total obedience to international dictates, complete cooperation with Israel, what's it got? It's got more settlements, more violence, more arrests, less and less space for Palestinians. I mean, long before last year, I went to Palestine myself, and I wrote a long feature about the situation there. And all the talk, and this is in April 2023, all the talk then was of genocide, of a slow genocide, of the slow squeezing of Palestinians off their land, of making an economy impossible. I mean, it has been clear for decades that what Israel wants is to rid themselves as much as possible of the Palestinian population, take the entire territory of Palestine, and be done with it. Smotrich's plan, is precisely that. Get as rid of as many people as you can, and the rest would have to accept second-class status. And that's what's been happening in the West Bank under Abbas. And as such, he has no credibility. And as such, the gap between him and Hamas, that stream of thinking, and Hamas has only widened over the years, because you can't have a compromise between we have to do everything we're told and no, we have to fight. There's no in between there. So one would have hoped that at a time of genocide against the Palestinian people, that if nothing else but shame would have intervened to bring the sides together in the overriding interests of the Palestinian people. And it is in the overriding interests of the Palestinian people right now to have some kind of a unified leadership that represents everybody in order to move forward. It is absolutely crucial, and the fact that it isn't happening is appalling, and it shows the level to which Palestinian politics has sadly descended.
Nora, do I have time for one more quick thing?
Absolutely.
I just want to let people know that in addition to being a brilliant analyst and writer, Omar is one of our editors who works very closely with our writers in Gaza. Many of the features and first-person accounts that you read from Gaza, Omar edits working directly with our writers in Gaza. And so, Omar, I just wanted to ask you very quickly to say a few words about our writers in Gaza and what it's like working with them under these circumstances.
Well, I mean, they've been amazing. They've been incredible, incredibly courageous. And I think what they have provided us with their first-person testimonies, with their reporting from Gaza, is a unique record of genocide, which I don't think, I can't think of a parallel. Obviously, it's been heart-wrenching in many times. The stories we read, the stories they tell us are just appalling, and the suffering and the indignity that they have to suffer, and they are suffering, is simply incredible. And yet to still find it within them to write and to want to engage, want to show the rest of the world what they're going through is just, it's incredible. And I think we should all be very grateful to them.
Yeah, and it's a true honor to be able to work with these incredible writers, reporters, people who shouldn't be reporting on what they're reporting. They should be living their lives as free and liberated people in all their dignity. It just continues to be unbearable, but we're so honored to be able to work with our contributors. And we're honored to work with you every day, Omar. You are an associate editor and our colleague at the Electronic Intifada. Read Omar's latest analysis. I mentioned it at the top. It's called Rudderless, Incompetent, and Complicit. You wrote it on June 1st, which seems like a million years ago already, but it is absolutely still very, very, very newsy. And
there's a great follow-up, a great piece, I think, just from yesterday,
right,
about Denmark.
On Denmark, yeah, right. The social democracy of Denmark, engaging with joy to encourage and be complicit in this genocide. So, thank you so much, Omar, for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Omar.
And you are watching and listening to the Electronic Intifada live stream. I'm Nora Barrows-Friedman with Ali Abunimah, and coming up, we'll get a full update from Jon Elmer, who will cover the resistance throughout the Gaza Strip from Rafah to Beit Hanoun. But first, our regular viewers and readers have known for months that Israel's claims of mass rape by Hamas fighters on October 7th are a total lie, a fabrication that has been used to incite and justify Israel's ongoing genocide in Gaza. Israel has identified no victims, living or dead, no credible eyewitnesses, and no forensic evidence to support the claim that sexual violence was used on a wide scale as a weapon of war on October 7th. But if, like most people, you read the New York Times, watch the BBC, the CBC, or read The Guardian or stories from Associated Press, among countless other mainstream outlets, you would think all these lies are true, that this campaign of rape really happened, and that only very marginal people would deny it. Now there is a significant, if only partial, break in this wall of lies, and Ali is going to tell us more about it. We're also going to talk about a late-breaking development, the publication this morning of a report by the UN Human Rights Council's Independent Commission of Inquiry and what it says about those claims. Ali, so what is new in this story that we've been covering and debunking over and over again for much of the last 8 months?
Yeah, thank you, Nora. The first new development is that the Times of London has become the first mainstream publication to acknowledge that there is simply no credible evidence for Israel's mass rape claims.
And just to be clear, you're talking about the Times of London, not the New York Times.
That's right. The Times of London has no relationship to the New York Times, even though both are often just known as the Times in their respective countries. But since we're going to be talking about both of them, I'm going to try to be clear which one I mean. Now, the Times of London is centuries old, but for the last few decades, it's been owned by Rupert Murdoch's News Corporation, and so it's considered quite right-wing. And like other mainstream media, it participated fully in spreading Israel's genocidal lies. You can see, for example, this front page from October 11th, spreading the lie that Hamas beheaded Israeli babies.
Right. So it's surprising that a newspaper like the Times of London would publish a story debunking the mass rape lies. Tell us about that story, of course.
Yeah, you can see the headline of the article here was published on June 7th. Israel says Hamas weaponized rape. Does the evidence add up? And then the teaser says the Israeli government insists that Hamas formally sanctioned sexual assault on October 7, 2023. But investigators say the evidence does not stand up to scrutiny. Catherine Phillip and Gabriel Weiniger report on 8 months of claims and counterclaims, end quote. So as you can see there, the Times of London is framing this cautiously, but when you read through all the caveats, it's clear what the article is saying. There's no evidence for Israel's key claim that there was widespread sexual violence ordered and planned by Hamas as a weapon of war. Where they hedge their bets and allow Israeli propagandists to score a few points in the article is by claiming that, well, maybe there's no evidence of systematic rapes ordered by Hamas, but there were probably still a few isolated incidents here and there. I've said in previous episodes of this live stream, and I stand by this, that our analysis shows that not only was there no mass rape, no deliberate use of sexual violence as a weapon of war, but that there is no credible evidence of even a single rape on October 7th.
Ali, there's a lot to get into in terms of this article, but what stands out to you from what the Times reported?
A key feature of this article that has been absent from virtually all mainstream media is a reasonably honest assessment of the UN report issued in early March by the team headed by Pramila Patten, the UN Secretary General's special representative on sexual violence in armed conflict. The vast majority of coverage spun that report as finding convincing evidence and therefore giving the UN's blessing to Israel's mass rape narrative. But in fact, the opposite is the case, as the Times of London explains in this passage. And I quote, "The Israeli political establishment has opened a fresh battle with the UN over what the Patten report didn't say, that sexual violence was beyond reasonable doubt, systematic, widespread, and ordered and perpetrated by Hamas. Israeli advocates for the female survivors are now warning that the country's refusal to cooperate with a full and legal investigation, which the carefully worded report was not, threatens the prospect of ever finding out the full truth about the sexual violence of October 7 and delivering justice for the victims." I'll note it's interesting that the report, that the Times of London refers to victims several times, because it doesn't actually show us that there are any. And the article also affirms several times, and this is an important fact, that Israel has absolutely rejected all calls from the UN and others to cooperate with an independent inquiry, and we'll talk more about that later.
Right, and that's a really important point. And you have to wonder why Israel doesn't want independent investigators to take even a cursory look at its claims, let alone, any sort of in-depth investigation.
Yes, and the Times of London article acknowledges that there was a lot of lying from very early on. It states here that, quote, litigating sexual violence within a conflict is difficult enough at the best of times, not least on a battlefield of the scale and complexity of October 7th. It becomes even harder without testimony from any survivors, the usual linchpin of such investigations. So there you can see, they spoke earlier about victims, and here they say there are no victims. What would make the effort over October 7th harder still were the examples of false and misleading information from senior political figures and government-linked civil activists to those in police and security services tasked with the official investigation. So there you have acknowledgement of two key facts that we've been stating all along. Israel keeps telling us to believe Israeli women, but there are no Israeli women to believe when it comes to October 7th rapes. And the second fact, no surprise to anyone, is that Israel lies a lot, not just officials, but so-called civil activists, police and security services who knowingly or carelessly spread false information.
Right. And give us some examples of these civil actors or activists participating in this hoax all along.
Yeah, this is important because outside Israel, groups like Physicians for Human Rights, which published a widely cited report in November repeating many of the sexual atrocity claims, have been held up as sort of independent, brave sources who can be believed because, they're not the Israeli government or they're respected human rights groups. But as we reported, Physicians for Human Rights Israel walked back those claims last month in an effort to restore its tattered credibility. It's too little too late, but you can see our headline here. Israeli rights group admits it helped spread false claims about October 7 rapes. And another of these so-called civil activists who got a huge amount of international attention and interviews and traveled around the world being greeted as a hero is 𝐄𝐥𝐿 who is celebrated around the world. And she got the Israel Prize even for setting up a so-called civil commission to investigate the mass rapes. She spread lies, including notoriously a graphic photo of a Kurdish female fighter in another country, which she falsely claimed was an Israeli rape victim. But it turned out that 𝐄𝐥𝐿 never did any investigation, and the whole civil commission was a grift in order to collect money. Again, you can see here how we reported on that in March with our story headlined, Israeli Commission on 7 October Rape Claims Exposed as a Fraud. And by the way, all of that is based on Israeli forces, which are fully cited in the article.
Yeah, and she collected a lot of money with that grift. Does the Times of London delve into any of the evidence that supposedly corroborates the mass rape story?
Yeah, I think one of the most important things the Times of London story does is it confirms what we said very early on, that the so-called eyewitnesses that have been paraded around in the media have no credibility whatsoever. There are actually 3 of them. It also demonstrates indirectly how the New York Times continues to stand by the outright lies written by Jeffrey Gettleman and his co-authors Anat Schwartz and Adam Seller in the notorious Screams Without Words article that they published in December. It also further confirms, as we've been saying, that there is absolutely no photographic or video evidence documenting rapes.
So walk us through some of these points, Ali. First, how does the Times of London article further confirm that Jeffrey Gettleman and the New York Times are lying and have been lying this whole time?
Let's look at one of the key witness accounts, eyewitnesses. The Times of London states that, quote, on November 14, the Israeli police held their first press conference for the international media on their investigations into sexual assault. Despite promising new evidence on its systematic nature, none was provided. A short video clip was aired with testimony by witness S, who described in horrific detail witnessing a gang rape and murder while hiding at the festival. That's the Supernova Festival. To this date, police have not interviewed a single survivor. On December 24, the police issued a decree to hospitals ordering them to hand over accounts of any rape survivor who had sought treatment. On January 4th, the police put out a fresh appeal for witnesses, saying they had succeeded in interviewing just 3 and had been unable to match their accounts with the bodies collected from the massacre site, end quote. Now, note that witness S is the same woman that Jeffrey Gettleman and company interviewed for the Screams Without Word article published on December 28th by the New York Times. And in that article, she is identified as Sapir. You may recall that Sapir's lurid account included the claim that she witnessed a group of Hamas fighters gang raping a group of Israeli women. In one case, she claimed that one of the Hamas men cut off one of the victim's breasts and the men started tossing it around like a ball. Sapir also made the incredible claim that the Hamas men cut off the heads of several of the women and were prancing about with them. Except there was a major problem. There was absolutely no physical evidence backing up this outlandish story. Where were the severed heads and where were the headless bodies? Where was the copious blood and DNA that would have been left behind from such a grisly crime? How could Sapir's account be taken seriously without a shred of corroboration? So after Gettleman's story came under scrutiny, including by us at the Electronic Intifada, and started to fall apart, the Times allowed Gettleman to write a follow-up story to try to repair the damage. And that story was published on January 29th. In that follow-up story, Gettleman makes this extraordinary claim, and I quote, "The police said they found Sapir's bag where she said she had been hiding and women's clothing near where she said the rapes occurred. And 3 severed heads were found farther away near the bodies of assailants in military fatigues," Israeli officials said without providing more detail, end quote. Well, isn't that convenient? But as far as I know, Jeffrey Gettleman and the New York Times are the only outlet to ever claim that the Israeli police found 3 severed heads. And you can imagine, we've said this before, that it would have been a huge global story and you would have seen it in outlets all over the world. But Gettleman just drops it in as a throwaway line in this follow-up story with no further elaboration. We've never heard anything about it ever again. And now let's go back to the piece in the Times of London. Recall the sentence I just read you. I'll read it again. Quote, "On January 4th, the police put out a fresh appeal for witnesses saying they'd succeeded in interviewing just 3 and had been unable to match their accounts with the bodies collected from the massacre site." End quote. So there you have it. The police could not and still cannot match any of the so-called eyewitness accounts to bodies. So no severed heads and no headless bodies to corroborate Sapir's account. So the New York Times and Jeffrey Gettleman are liars.
What about photographic and video evidence? That should have been easy to find, right?
Well, we've pointed out previously that both the UN report by Pramila Patten and Israeli security agencies, multiple Israeli security agencies speaking to the Israeli newspaper Haaretz, have confirmed that Israel has not found a single photograph or video showing a rape taking place. And that's an extraordinary absence given Israel's insistence that the sexual violence was systematic and pervasive. Speaking of the UN report, here's what the Times of London says, quote, "In all the Hamas video footage Patton's team had watched and all the photographs they had seen, there were no depictions of rape. We hired a leading Israeli dark web researcher to look for evidence of those images, including footage deleted from public sources. None could be found," end quote. So you see there that the Times of London actually did its own investigation to attempt to find video or photos of sexual violence taking place. And as they state, none could be found. Despite this, Western politicians continue to lie that such footage exists. Last week, we talked about how Annalena Baerbock, the German foreign minister, claimed in late May that she had personally watched, soon after October 7th, a video of a rape taking place filmed by a member of Hamas. A total lie. A few days later, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz lied at a European Parliament election rally in Leipzig that Hamas members had filmed themselves raping Israeli women. People can read more about that at the Electronic Intifada, where I wrote about it.
Yeah. And you mentioned that the Times of London does try to make excuses for these lies, as well as to maintain some elements of the sexual violence narrative. How do they do that? How do they thread that needle?
Well, one positive element of the story that should be mentioned is that for the first time I've seen a mainstream outlet is acknowledging the inherently racist nature of the mass rapes narrative. The Times of London says, quote, "The idea of the Arab male as an explicit sexual threat to Jewish women developed in tandem with the movement of Israeli politics to the right," end quote. But unfortunately, this has not developed very much further. The correct context to put it in, again, as we've done in previous programs, is to point out that the idea that indigenous, brown, black, or enslaved men are sexual predators towards white or settler women is as old as colonialism itself. This lie has been used as justification to murder, lynch, exterminate, and control colonized men for centuries. It was also used by the Nazis as propaganda against Jewish men, claiming they were a violent sexual threat to pure German women. Instead, the Times of London attributes the Israeli lies to Jewish trauma, claiming, quote, that for Jewish Israelis, the specter of rape was more closely associated historically with the pogroms of Eastern Europe, in which thousands of Jews were killed and Jewish women raped by Christian soldiers and anti-Semitic mobs, end quote. So there you can see the excuses, traumatized Jewish people can be forgiven for making up these absolute genocidal lies. And there's another instance in which they claim that Jewish trauma is responsible. In fact, not Jewish trauma so much as Jewish faith is responsible for the genocidal lies told by members of 𝐓𝐿𝐿, the religious extremist rescue group whose leaders were responsible for some of the most atrocious lies about burned children, a fetus cut out of its mother, and other fabrications. We talked about 𝐓𝐿𝐿 and its role in the mass rapes hoax in detail in our discussion last month, debunking the Sheryl Sandberg film Screams Before Silence. But the Times of London quotes a woman called Orit Sulitzianu, the head of the Israeli government-aligned Association of Rape Crisis Centers in Israel, stating, quote, "They're all religious guys. Most of them are ultra-religious. They never saw a woman except their wife. So to see all those photos, how did they deal with that?" Her explanation is that because they're religious Jews who don't, presumably, in her view, don't know female anatomy, well, they can be forgiven for making up this atrocity propaganda. And they quote another academic called Sarai Aharoni, who also attributes the lies to the men's Judaism and study of Jewish texts. These excuses for the liars, hoaxers, and fraudsters at 𝐓𝐿𝐿, who raised millions of dollars from media appearances and events on the backs of their lies, are, in my opinion, anti-Semitic. Yeah. Their lies have nothing to do with their being Jewish and everything to do with the fact that they're part of a racist, colonial, genocidal state that is acting the same way as other such states in history.
Absolutely. Do you have other criticisms of the Times of London story that you think might help us understand how this Israeli mass rapes narrative is going to evolve after this?
Yeah, because it's never going to go away, is it? Well, a couple of the so-called experts, whom the Times of London quotes as being critical of the mass rape story, were themselves full participants in the hoax. One of these is Orit Sulitzianu, the head of the government-aligned, Association of Rape Crisis Centers in Israel. Now, Sulitzianu is quoted by Jeffrey Gettleman in the New York Times, making up excuses for why no victims had been located. Now, here she is in the Times of London trying to explain away the lies. Another is Ruth Halperin Kadari, who markets herself as an international expert on women's rights. She is extensively quoted in the Times of London doing two things. First, she falsely presents herself as a cautious person who is critical of the excesses and lies told about the rapes. Second, she tries to rescue the narrative by saying, in effect, well, maybe there's no evidence for mass rapes, but there were definitely some rapes. I'm paraphrasing, but that's the gist of her comments. But Ruth Halperin Kadari must not be permitted to get away with laundering herself in this manner, nor can Orit Sulitzianu. Here's a brief clip of Ruth Halperin Kadari talking to Sheryl Sandberg and rationalizing why no victims, living or dead, have been identified.
Most of the victims were murdered and silenced forever, but we know that there are survivors. and it will take a very long time before they speak out, if ever they speak out.
So there you can see how convenient. Isn't that convenient? Well, now it gets even worse. So now let's look at another clip of Ruth Halperin Kadari telling the story of Sapir, the so-called eyewitness we just discussed, who told the story about the Hamas men, tossing around a breast like a ball and carrying out a gang rape and then prancing around with severed heads. Let's look at that.
First eyewitness who stepped forward, a young woman who hid in the bushes and described that very close to her, a few yards from her, there was a group of Hamas terrorists who pulled by the hair another woman who was stripped from the waist down.
הוא מושך לה בשיער, היה לה שיער ארוך, הוא מושך לה בשיער. היא לא לבושה, ובעצם אני מבינה שהוא אנס אותה, הוא בעצם משנע אותה. כאילו, ממש אני זוכרת את התמונה הזאת. ואז מעבירים אותה לעוד מישהו, והוא חותך לה את השד. הוא חותך לה את השד, הוא זורק את זה על הכביש, הם משחקים עם זה.
The bodies whose breasts were cut were found in several other locations. It depicts a pattern that could not have been unless it was premeditated and preconceived by Hamas themselves.
So what you can see there, of course, is Ruth Halperin Kadari fully participating in the hoax in its most maximalist form, claiming that this was systematic, spreading the atrocity stories about breasts being cut off and so on. And that clip we heard in Hebrew, just for those who are listening, was a clip of, you'll remember I mentioned earlier, as the Times noted, the Times of London, the Israeli police played some of this interview with Sapir, or Witness S as they called her, at their press conference in November. And that was a clip of that video that the Israeli police showed of Witness S or Sapir, and where she is describing what we've just discussed, where she claims to have seen the gang rape and the breasts being cut off. And you can see Ruth Halperin Kadari spreading that. So it's important to know who these characters are and not allow them to whitewash themselves by distancing themselves from a genocidal hoax that they were full participants in creating. The Times of London did not disclose the roles of 𝐓𝐡𝐞 and Halperin Kadari in creating the hoax, and they presented them as if they were somehow independent and objective women's rights advocates. So that's something we need to keep an eye on. These hoaxers trying to rebrand and absolve themselves by now appearing to be, critics of the very genocidal lies they fully participated in spreading.
Yeah. How is Israel and its lobby, especially in the UK, as this is, circulating in the UK press, how are they reacting to this story?
Well, it won't surprise you that Israel and its lobby are mounting a major pressure campaign to try to get the Times to back away from the story. Here, for example, you can see a story in the Jewish Chronicle, one of the main Zionist mouthpieces in the UK, trying to discredit the reporting in the Times of London. We keep saying we hope we never have to talk about this story again, but they will keep trying to revive this totally discredited narrative. At the same time, more and more evidence of systematic torture and violence by Israel against Palestinians continues to emerge. The most recent reports from Israel's Beit Hanoun torture camp are absolutely horrific. And I have to warn that what I'm about to say is very graphic. For example, as our colleague Maureen Murphy writes in a recent piece, quote, Yunus al-Hamlawi, a senior nurse who was arrested in November after leaving Al-Shifa hospital in Gaza City, told the New York Times that during his interrogation at Sde Teiman, a female officer ordered 2 soldiers to penetrate his rectum with a metal stick, causing him to bleed and experience unbearable pain. End quote. That same detainee, interviewed by UNRWA, the UN Agency for Palestine Refugees, said that he and others, quote, were subjected to electrical shocks through their anuses, causing another man he was detained with to get sick and die, end quote. These are horrific accounts of sexual torture that are very similar to what American torturers did at Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq 20 years ago. And as Maureen also notes, Al-Hamlawi's testimony was buried dozens of paragraphs down in a lengthy feature story published in the New York Times, which makes no mention of sexual abuse reported by Palestinian detainees in either the title or teaser. And that's just such a stark contrast with how the New York Times gave sensationalist front page coverage to its discredited stories about mass rapes by Hamas on October 7th, fabricated stories that the New York Times still stands by. And I just want to say that the significance of the Times of London story is not so much its contents, which, you know, our viewers and readers largely know, but the fact that a mainstream outlet published this at all. We would not be here if it hadn't been for the work of independent outlets and individuals, especially our friend Zay Squirrel on Twitter, Mondoweiss, The Grey Zone, The Intercept, which finally saw the light after itself participating in the hoax initially, and of course us here at the Electronic Intifada.
Absolutely. Well, finally, as we wrap up, there is some late-breaking news. This morning, the UN Human Rights Council's Independent Commission of Inquiry issued its first report on what happened on and since October 7th in Israel and in Gaza. Obviously, this just came out. We haven't had time to read through the whole long report, but have you had a chance to take a look at some of the main points?
Yes, I had a quick look, and it deserves a careful reading. One notable thing that stood out is that it states, quote, the Commission documented strong indications that the Hannibal Directive was used in several instances on 7 October, harming Israelis at the same time as striking Palestinian militants. The Hannibal Directive is Israel's doctrine that allows it to kill its own people to avoid them being taken captive. We will need to go back and read all that carefully, but it does, of course, corroborate what we've been reporting all along, that Israel killed many, if not most, of its own people on October 7th with tank fire, helicopters, and other types of weaponry. But I did have a closer look at what the report says about sexual and gender-based violence on October 7th, because I was preparing for this discussion. And it's important to know that those are very broad terms as used in the report. They do not refer only to rape or sexual assault. The report appears to use the term sexual or gender-based violence to refer to any sort of violence done against women. And that's important to keep in mind when reading the report, because it does claim that there are, quote, reasonable grounds to conclude that Hamas carried out acts of what it calls sexual and gender-based violence. But that in no way equates with sexual assaults or rapes. And I just want to give an example. It cites, for example, things like photos of individuals, quote, being partially or fully undressed, end quote, as evidence of sexual or gender-based violence. But when you read through it all, you get to the bottom line, which is that they could not verify any rapes or sexual assaults. It also references so-called witness accounts that look to me that they are repetitions of the debunked claims of the 𝐄𝐥𝐿 hoaxers. So, with all of these UN reports, even independent inquiries like this one, they tend to bend over backwards to try to appease Israel and give credence to its narrative. But then buried in the text, you get to the heart of the matter. In this case, the report says that the Commission, quote, and this is really important, sent a request for information to Israel in inquiring about additional information in relation to rape and other forms of sexual violence, including evidence of any instructions provided to the perpetrators responsible for the attack on 7 October 2023 to carry out such acts, or information on specific cases of gender-based crimes on 7 October, including cases of rape and other forms of sexual violence. It has not received a response, end quote. The commission also states, and I quote, the commission was not able to reach a definitive conclusion with regards to rape, end quote. It also says that it faced, quote, active attempts by Israeli authorities to obstruct the commission's access to information related to sexual violence. Such measures include instructing medical professionals not to cooperate with the commission, end quote. The report also says that, quote, the commission notes the absence of forensic evidence of sexual crimes committed on 7 October, end quote. That's a point we've been making in our coverage for months. The commission also confirms that, quote, it has not met any survivors of sexual violence committed on 7 October, despite its attempts to do so, end quote. And when it comes to the issue of rape, the report says, quote, the commission has seen open source reports stating that Israeli civilians were subjected to rape and other forms of sexual violence at various sites in southern Israel on 7 October. The commission has reviewed testimonies obtained by journalists and the Israeli police concerning rape, but has not been able to independently verify such allegations due to a lack of access to victims, witnesses, and crime sites, and the obstruction of its investigations by the Israeli authorities, end quote. It also says, quote, the commission has viewed reports asserting that documents found on militants who were killed or arrested contain alleged instructions to undress civilians or commit rape or other forms of sexual violence during the attack on 7 October. The commission was unable to obtain copies of these documents and was unable to verify their authenticity, end quote. And just like the Pramila Patten report, this UN Commission of Inquiry actually debunks the most lurid claims. This report states, quote, the commission was also unable to verify reports of sexualized torture and genital mutilation. Additionally, the commission found some specific allegations to be false, inaccurate, or contradictory with other evidence or statements and discounted these from its assessment, end quote.
Well, our friend Zay Squirrel said on Twitter earlier today that it's over. This hoax, this propaganda, it's done because of what this commission and the Times of London has said. What do you think the impact of this new report will be? Do you think it's done? Are we done with this?
Well, it's done if you're people like us who care about the facts and who actually read beyond the headlines and the spin. But I think a lot of people are going to pull things out of context and try to spin this report as supporting Israel's narrative, just as they did with the Pramila Patten report, when in fact it does not offer anything beyond what we've already seen, and it reaches no conclusions about rape and asserts very clearly that it could not verify any of the allegations of rape. And that, again, Israel, which should welcome such an investigation, has done everything possible to obstruct one. You have to wonder why. Yeah. By contrast, the same Commission of Inquiry in its report on what has been happening in Gaza says, quote, testimonies, NGO reports, video footage, and photos reviewed by the Commission indicate a large increase in the range, frequency, and severity of sexual and gender-based violence perpetrated by Israeli security forces against Palestinians since 7 October 2023. This is among many other Israeli war crimes and atrocities that the report documents, and I've obviously not had time to read all of those findings yet, but I'm certain we'll be covering them at the Electronic Intifada. And in the case of Palestinian victims of Israeli sexual violence, the report says, quote, the commission collected and preserved evidence including testimonies, photos, and video footage of sexual violence directed against Palestinian men by Israeli security forces during ground operations in the Gaza Strip and in the West Bank, including forced public nudity, forced stripping, and sexual humiliation, abuse, and harassment, end quote. And it goes into detail also about abuse of Palestinian women. And with respect to Palestinian victims, the report says, quote, the Commission's findings on sexual and gender-based violence are based on testimonies obtained by the Commission from victims and witnesses, as well as forensic analysis of verified digital content. Contrast that with how the Commission said it was not able to interview a single Israeli victim. So this report needs to be read carefully, and we need to be attentive to how Israel and its lobby are going to try to take a few sentences here and there out of context to try to claim it offers something new to support their narrative, which it does not, while downplaying the findings regarding Israeli sexual and other forms of violence against Palestinians.
Thank you so much, Ali. And yeah, we will continue to cover this as long as we have to. It is just truly shocking, especially, amongst not just the revelations that you referenced in terms of the New York Times article, where they buried these just horrific accounts with actual evidence, of course, and testimonies of actual victims who actually exist. Palestinians who have gone through the most horrific torture by their Israeli captors, but that the torture and especially sexual violence against Palestinians is not a new phenomenon. It's not one-off. It is systematic, and this is something that has been documented for decades by Palestinian human rights organizations, and with corroborating forensic evidence by Palestinians themselves, and so it's just yeah.
Yeah, and I often wonder, I ask myself, should we be spending so much time on this? There's so much to cover. Should we keep going back to this hoax that we've debunked repeatedly? And the reason I think it's important to keep doing this as they keep trying to revive it is because, they claim, there's that saying that journalism is the first draft of history. And you look at how the mainstream media are complicit in this propaganda. And I do not want anyone to be able to look back in the future and say, nobody knew at the time that these were genocidal lies. We need to make this part of the historical record. We need history to record that this was not true, that these were this defamation against Palestinians was used as an excuse to murder them, to exterminate them. And we have to make sure that the truth is what's recorded as history, not Israel's lies, not the New York Times' lies.
That's right. Well, thank you for that, as always, Ali. And you are watching and listening to the Electronic Intifada live stream. I'm Nora Barrows-Friedman with Ali Abunimah, and we will bring on our colleague, Jon Elmer. Hey, John.
Hey, guys. It's great to see Omar.
Yeah, it's really good to have him. So you're going to be just an unspeakable week again of atrocities and horrors beyond comprehension. But you have, as always, compiled sort of a way to understand how Palestinians are fighting back, of course, and especially this week, we wanted to have you talk a little bit more in depth about the Netzarim corridor and its role in how the Israelis carried out the raid on Nuseirat last Saturday, because I think it's really important that people understand what happened and what didn't happen. So anyway, take us through the last week on the ground in Gaza.
All right. Well, we will start the resistance report this week in the south. We'll just throw up a map here so people can get a sense of the area that we're looking at. We're going to be covering Rafah first on the southern border there with Egypt. We have operations in Khan Yunis in the middle camps there where it says Gaza. It's actually the middle camps. Netzarim corridor where the Nuseirat operation took place from on the weekend. You see Gaza City. There was operations in Gaza City. There was operations along the Netzarim corridor. Again, it's been a Just like every other place that the Israelis are, there's resistance wherever they go. And then we have a follow-up this week to the Beit Hanoun ambush that we covered a couple weeks ago, because a Qassam commander spoke to Al Jazeera and gave us some extended footage of that operation. So we will cover that. So we are going literally from the Egyptian border in the south to the very northeast of the Gaza Strip on the resistance report today. So we'll start with number one, because Israel's been saying that they have, we've heard this before, but last week they said they had operational control over the entire Philadelphia corridor along the Egypt-Gaza border. And what we're seeing here is Saraya al-Quds, Islamic Jihad's military wing, on the Philadelphia corridor. Clearly here you can see the wall there, and setting up mortar teams to fire on Israeli positions in the Philadelphia corridor. Israel taking the Philadelphia corridor, as I said on previous programs, is not some significant military accomplishment. It's a demilitarized zone and has been for the last decade between Egypt and the Palestinians in Gaza. It was a demilitarized zone after the Israelis withdrew from the Gaza Strip. But we see here Israel taking the entire corridor. It includes the Rafah crossing, so people haven't been able to leave Gaza for any kind of medical attention, people leaving Gaza in any way. Aid workers haven't been able to enter Gaza, so it's been a complete seal-off of the south. The Kerem Shalom crossing has been more or less shut completely since the beginning of May. But Israel's claiming operational control over this area, and you can see in the footage right there, that's the border fence. So Saraya al-Quds is on the border, showing us surveillance on the border, and then showing us their mortar teams operating. And so Israel's been saying that they've been saying through the whole war, for at least for the last 6 months, that there's 4 battalions in Rafah that they're fighting that have to be fought before they can claim ultimate victory in Gaza. But we know that that is not a meaningful distinction. The battalions are not all a fixed size. They're not a fixed structure like a building that you demolish. They're fluid. They can move, they can change their formations, they can reform. They have different skill sets in each battalions. There's special forces battalions and just infantry battalions. So this idea that there's 4 battalions, and as long as Israel touches each of the 4 battalions in Rafah, that they can claim victory in Gaza, is, like all the other claims, ridiculous. But Israel says that they will be wrapping up the operation in Rafah in the next few weeks, according to Israeli Army radio. So it doesn't look like they're operating in Rafah in the way they did in Khan Yunis, that took more than 6 months. The Americans are, of course, tripping over themselves to say that this is not an invasion, as Omar rightly pointed out. It's absurd. They've carried out multiple massacres in Rafah and forced more than 1 million, almost 1.5 million people out of Rafah into the middle camps area, where they were then attacked in the middle camp. So this is absolutely an invasion of Rafah. It's devastating to the civilians, but the Americans and Israelis are playing this game where they're saying that this isn't the full invasion of Rafah. So that's the Philadelphia corridor. I think that this footage is interesting to show you that operational control doesn't mean the most important parts of having control of the border. And also just what we see here, and something that we'll be watching for in the coming weeks, is that this is a massive supply line for the Israelis to try to hold the Philadelphia corridor from Kerem Shalom in the southeast corner all the way to the Mediterranean coast. It's like double the size of anywhere else in Gaza. The Israelis haven't had a supply line anything close to that anywhere else. The only example that you might have is Khan Yunis, which is also almost as wide as Rafah. And we remember back then, I showed you footage of the Israelis airdropping resupply to their soldiers in Khan Yunis because their supply line got cut off. And so this supply line in Rafah is much more significant than the supply line was to Khan Yunis that required airdrops and was cut off. So this is something that I think we'll be watching for here on the border. Of course, the Israelis are saying that they're finding tunnels on the border here with Egypt, which is something that they've known about since at least the late 90s. And one of the reasons why the Israelis left the Gaza Strip in 2005 was because of a series of attacks right along this route that you're looking at on camera right here, where underground tunnels were dug under Israeli military positions and blown up using the tunnel, blew up Israeli positions, blew up Israeli armored vehicles all along this corridor. This corridor was a fierce corridor of fighting all through the Second Intifada. As I've said on the show a number of times. We can go to number 2 here. This is fighting in south of Rafah. So they're just moving up from the corridor and fighting. You see the famous Yassin 105 tandem charge warhead on the Yassin RPG built in Gaza, hitting their Al-Namr troop carrier. And just to say it again, we've said it before, but this is Qassam says that the entire program to build their own Yassin 105 anti-tank warheads, the total R&D development, putting them into service, building them, comes out to $500 per unit. And you see them here blasting away at a $4 million troop carrier with 12 soldiers inside. And again, we're seeing in Rafah, look at that. It's just a perfectly painted, apparently brand new Yassin 105. There's been more than 1,400 of these attacks, and we're still seeing them use weapons that are the proper weapon, what they call appropriate weapons for the situation. This is an armored vehicle. They use the Yassin 105 against the heaviest armed vehicles, and in Rafah they're using these supplies, and we'll watch all through this show that they use them all throughout. We can go to the next one. That they use them all throughout Gaza. We're seeing the same thing. And so here you see a tandem 85. This is called a tandem 85 warhead. And what it was is Qassam added a tandem charge onto the original single charge 85 millimeter. So this is a pure Qassam creation. This weapon doesn't exist anywhere else in the world except for Gaza. And we see them using it here on Caterpillar D9 armored bulldozers because the armor isn't as thick as it is on the tanks. And so you can see there, that's the tandem 85. And so they're using, again, appropriate weapons, hitting these bulldozers with a weapon that is appropriate for their level of armor. You can see the slat armor there in that shot of Qassam puts up there. The slat armor attempts to break up the warhead as it comes in so that the shape charge doesn't form. But the armor is nowhere near as significant as it is on the armored vehicles. So we're seeing them use that. And again, we're looking here using the destruction, the military vandalism as cover. You can see the fighters are literally in the building beside these bulldozers, these tanks. We'll see it all through the program. We've seen it for the last 8 months. The fighters are able to move through the city and get in position to hit these vehicles from the closest possible place. And so that has been going on throughout this war as well. We'll just look at one more time. So he's in a building. He's in the closest building here to the D9 bulldozer. And the D9 bulldozers are shaping the landscape for the tanks. So where the bulldozers are, the tanks aren't far behind. They're shaping the landscape to protect the tanks. And I think we're going to see that in this next one here. If we go to number 4 tomorrow. Okay, yeah, that's good. People saw that one. So you can see here, this tank is in the middle of a destroyed area where the bulldozers have piled up in an attempt to protect the tank, which we can see there on film clearly didn't work. And this is now a second Yassin shooter. That's still the dust from the first Yassin. So they're using side-by-side shooters in a building beside 2 tanks that are side by side. And you can see there the Yassin 105 on the left, he fires first, and the guy in the bottom there has the tandem 85. So they use the Yassin 105 against the tank, the first hit, but the second hit you can use the tandem 85 because the armor has already been weakened by the first shot. So we see 2 Yassins here versus 2 tanks. And then we see the tandem 85. If you look at the bottom of the screen there, you can see the tandem 85. He actually doesn't fire. But when we see that being used in conjunction with the 105, it's appropriate weapons because the armor is weakened by the original shot by the 105, and then they use the 85. So even in these instances where they're using the tandem 85 against a tank, it's still appropriate weapons. And this shot is interesting. You see the debris go up from this tank here, clearly being hit. That's not an interception by the Trophy 8 active protection system. The radar can't pick you up when you're popping out of rubble like this. So that's the dust from the original hit. So they're hitting 2 tanks with 3 Yassins, which is was something we have seen before, but is interesting to see in this intimate way here in southern central Rafah. This is actually in the Jibna block of Rafah. We go to the next one. The way that Rafah is organized, so Rafah is all one refugee camp according to the United Nations, but in Rafah they divide up all the neighborhoods by the camps' names from the villages that they left. Like Gibna is a village that was ethnically cleansed in 1948, that's just south of Jaffa, and the people from there walked to the Gaza Strip and set up in the refugee camp here. But in the neighborhood, they call the neighborhood the Yibna camp, but it's all Rafah camp. And we could see Yassin 105 strike, again, moving through the alleyways to get into basically the closest place you could get to hitting that tank. That's across the street, way too close for the active protection system to kick in. It's difficult to know what the explosions are. The explosions could be several things. So it's tough to say. I don't want to pinpoint exactly what it is, but I've read on previous programs what Israeli tank crew experience when these direct hits happen. Again, you can see that one there. The front of the tank is actually heavily armored. Of course, the tank is built to be heavily armored on the front, and the Merkava tank is unique for tanks because it has the engine block in the front as well. So a hit like that might not hurt the crew, but it hits the engine because the engine is in the front of this vehicle to protect the thinking is that it protects the crew even further to have the metal engine in the way. But when you hit like this, then you get engine kills. And when we talk about the Nusayrat raid, there was engine kills in the Nusayrat raid, which were one of the reasons why the Israelis extended their massacre in Nusayrat, because they were pinned down by the resistance. We can go to the next one here. So this is a Sarai al-Quds Qassam joint operation. You can see the Israeli soldier there. See him sticking his gun out the window, flagging his gun out the window. Soldiers in a window, 9 months on, still doing it. And Qassam, if that soldier has his weapon where Qassam have their weapons inside the building, then he doesn't expose his position there, but he sees him dangling his rifle barrel out the window there, and he's about to get hit by a thermobaric warhead for doing it. You can see it come in just about in a minute here. And that's a fuel air explosion that is also a unique Qassam weapon, because theirs is a tandem charge as well. So there's a component of it that can knock the wall out before the fuel air charge hits. So that's a devastating weapon that's being used. There was field reports from the other day that said that that there was a booby trap in a building in Rafah that killed. The Israelis admitted to 11 casualties, 4 killed, at least 7 wounded when the building was blown up. And the IDF said that that's not this one, that's a different event, but I just wanted to throw it in here while we're watching this one. The IDF said that they threw an explosive device into the building and it didn't explode. And so they expected that the building was safe and entered, and Qassam booby-trapped the building and exploded it over their entire unit that had entered, which is just interesting because the Israelis threw the explosive device in order to set off the booby trap. And when the booby trap didn't go off, they thought they were safe. And so it's just a little example of how the luring part of the ambushes is so critical, because the Israelis are going into each of these buildings expecting that there's booby traps and expecting that they're going to be ambushed. And so how you can disguise the ambush is critical to the mission's success. And on Monday, there was 11 casualties in Rafah carrying out an operation like that. And that's a thermobaric warhead through the window. We can't see the window, but you can see the edge of the building there. So they're firing in. The soldier exposes himself with the rifle from one position and then is hit through a window on the other. Let's go to number 6 here. This is moving to Khan Yunis, because Khan Yunis has been out of the fight. Israel pulled out after that spectacular ambush on the night of power during Ramadan, and that chased the Israelis out of Khan Yunis. But here we see 𝐄𝐤𝐿 𝐄𝐿 and 𝐓𝐡𝐞 fighters loading up 107 millimeter rocket artillery here. And we see them again using their Iron Peacemaker, play on the Iron Dome, Peace Enforcer, maybe we'll call it. That's the firing, the control device for firing these rockets. You could see that 𝐓𝐡𝐞 has their own built with labels on it, and they call that version 3. So it's the third version of the Iron Peacemaker. And this fighter, as he's loading the fuses, that's putting the fuse on the end of that weapon. So the weapon is not, it's safe until you put the fuse on. So they're using proper techniques here. This fighter says, "Our message to Israel, we have sworn to be the generation of liberation. We will have nothing for you but swords and fire, and the sword of Al-Quds remains unsheathed. You will not return to the envelope. You will not return to the envelope," he says. And this is something that captives that have been released had said that their fighters said to, that their guards said to them too, in their, they had positive relationships, and the guards said to them, like, when we let you go, don't move back to the envelope, move to Tel Aviv, don't move back to the envelope. And we see 𝐓𝐡𝐞 fighters in the field saying that now to the IDF. And just one more thing on this, on the envelope, is that this week the commander of IDF Gaza Division, Brigadier General Avi Rosenfeld, announced that he is resigning from the military over his involvement in the failures that led to Hamas's October 7 onslaught. In a letter to the head of the Southern Command and the IDF Chief of Staff, Rosenfeld writes that on October 7th, I failed in my life's mission to protect the Gaza envelope. So they're IDF taking the fall there for the devastating military defeat that they suffered on October 7th. And in that video from Khan Yunis, we have the fighter telling the IDF and telling the Israelis that they're not going back to the envelope, that they're going to keep up the attacks to prevent them from going back to the envelope. So that's interesting note that I wanted to throw in there. So we're going to move to the middle camps now. That was Rafah, Khan Yunis. Now we're moving up to the middle camps. This is Deir al-Balah. In the middle camps, and the Israelis invaded. This is number 7 tomorrow. The Israelis invaded earlier on Wednesday of last week, just as we were doing our show. Last week they invaded, and they said after the Nusrat invasion raid that what we're watching here, this invasion of Deir al-Balah, was a diversionary operation to pull fighters from Nusrat up further north, down into the lower middle camps here to fight. And so if that's what they did, watch these next series of videos, because they came out and got immediately hammered. You can see that's a tank there going up. You can see the fighters using the olive groves here, very Palestine, using the olive groves to watch this guy get, when he gets his helmet cam down, you're going to see the tanks just right in front of him. And they're moving through tunnels. All of these videos are, all the underpinning of these videos is that these are tunnel operations. The fighter goes back down in the tunnel, and you can hear him in the audio. If you go to my Twitter, you can hear the full audio. But he goes down in the tunnel and he says, "I blew it up to the squad." You saw the fighter there with bare feet. I think they use bare feet when they're coming out of the tunnels because the tunnels are so sandy. We've seen that a number of times. I think that's what that's for. We saw them barefoot when they raided in Gaza City, when they ran up the side of that sandy berm that the Israelis had built. And all the fighters had no shoes on in that situation. So I think that's what we're seeing, is them using it in the tunnels as better grip to get out of to climb out of the tunnels. So that's just something we'll have to ask them after, but I put a little question mark after that in my notes because it seems like that's what we're watching. But again, it's just incredible. Guy with no shoes blasting a $6 million Merkava tank with 10 guys inside cowering. They're cowering in the fight, but they're firing tank shells at civilians who have moved from Rafah up to Deir al-Balah to escape this. As soon as they got up there, they're hit as soon as they moved. And there's 1 million plus people that moved from Rafah to the middle camps, to Deir al-Balah, to what we're looking at right here. These attacks, these tanks are the tank shells that carry out the massacres that have a death toll. Even on a normal day is 100 people are killed by these operations. And how you have Qassam fighters moving through tunnels, moving through olive groves, blasting with homemade Gaza weapons that are clearly effective, getting within the 50 meters that they're trying to get in. The trees also get in the way of the radar of the active protection system. So that's something that fighting in these, and this is just more, this is one of the rare spots in Gaza where there are these kind of brush to fight in, because the Israelis, of course, blow up, bulldoze all the greenhouses, all the orchards. That's a standard part of their protocol. So yeah, it's a operation in Deir al-Balah, and we can see them using the tunnels. Again, let's go to number 8 tomorrow. You can see how close these fighters get here. It's a great shot of him moving through. You can see the tank there, and the fighter's going to move through the screen here because the cameraman's behind him. And I just wanted to note something while we watch this too, that the House Armed Services Committee yesterday released a section of a forthcoming proposed legislation that would, quote, require military exercises in U.S. Central Command area of responsibility to conduct an annual counter-tunneling exercise with Israel. It would authorize an additional $30 million for research and technology into the ongoing United States/Israel anti-tunnel cooperation project. That is on top of the $325 million Congress has provided since 2016, when this anti-tunnel effort cooperation started, according to the Congressional Research Service. And so this is U.S. funding for technology initiatives developed by the little-known Pentagon Irregular Warfare Technical Support Directorate. And the U.S. claims that they have enabled the IDF to discover over 1,500 new tunnel shafts, including 350 to 450 miles of tunnels since the war began on October 7th. So we have pure enmeshing of these tunnel operations that we're watching the fighters take part in and the Israelis get hit by. They're deeply entwined with the Americans on this project, and the Israelis have been working for a decade to try to combat these tunnels. And the first time they enter Deir al-Balah, the olive groves and the tunnels are destroying their vehicles. Is that number 8 tomorrow? Because I think this is number 9. Again, we're still in the olive groves. These were all on one video. So the Israelis invaded on Wednesday of last week. And on Thursday, 36 hours after the invasion began, we get this video that has 7 armored vehicles. I believe they're all tanked. There might be one bulldozer at the end, getting blasted here from close proximity by tandem charged warheads that penetrate 650 millimeters of folded armor. And this shot is interesting because you see the rest of the squad there. Can we roll that one again tomorrow? You can see the rest of the squad operating in this one, which is interesting. We don't get to see that very much with Qassam videos. We see a little more with Saraya videos, but using the orchards here on the out to get right in front of the tank barrel facing the fighter, coming up from a tunnel that the Americans have spent $350 million plus the additional $50 million that they're going to give them to continue to do that. And these fighters run off safely to their base and down through a tunnel. And if you want to see the tunnel here, number 10 shows you the tunnel as this fighter is going to come right out of the ground. He just comes right out of the sand, pops up in this greenhouse. And what's that bulldozer? This is a bulldozer. What's he doing? Probably demolishing the greenhouses, which we've seen many times before in this war. that Israel prioritizes that, destroying the greenhouses, not to destroy the tunnels, because if they bulldozed over this tunnel, you see the fighter coming out, all it does is loosen the topsoil and allows it to be easier to dig out of the tunnel and come up and use, again, appropriate weapons that he's using here. He's using an 85 millimeter anti-tank warhead, a single charge, but against the slat armor, it's effective. And then he slides back down safely into the tunnel. So that's something that we've seen multiple times throughout the war, Israel destroying greenhouses in it. I think there'll be a number of studies that come out in the months to come about the destruction of agricultural land in Gaza and how devastating that is, because Gaza was roughly self-sufficient in grown vegetables and fruits because they had to be living under a blockade. And they actually did that. They put a lot of resources into that self-sufficiency, cleaning up the groundwater and getting irrigation, and pushing the Israelis off the buffer zone, which Hamas and Qassam fighters did over the course of the 15-year siege on Gaza. Let's do number 11. So these are the same guys. They pop up in a tunnel in the same orchard, in the same olive grove, and they're going to come out here and they're going to pop up and see a house here with this telltale Israeli curtains on the window, the only house that they use as a base. And that looks to me like a thermobaric warhead. It's not painted the black that the tandem charge anti-tank is. We'll watch it again. You can see them go down into the tunnel after. It's a little bit more green, and it hits like a thermobaric, which would make sense. It's what they would use on that building. But normally the thermobarics are painted an obvious beige color. If people remember, we've seen them be used many times before, and you can usually identify it. But the way that it hits this building looks to me like a thermobaric weapon. Qassam doesn't always say the weapon, and the conveying the message from the field to the person who's writing the field reports doesn't always get the exact details correct. So we can't always rely on that. Let's do it one more time tomorrow, can we? Because the way he comes out of this tunnel, he comes up and he's going to fix his helmet here. There he goes. He fixes the GoPro for us, which is a nice touch. And then he sets himself up here, and watch him just move through the trees to get into a position, fire, and return immediately to his base safely. It's not a martyrdom mission. It's effectively executed mission where they know underground, the fighters are underground, and they know where to come up to hit the building that the Israeli force is in. And that's the advantage that Qassam has had for this entire war. And we've seen it in many different ways manifest itself. In this case here, because they are mapped, because it's mapped out underground where they are, they're able to pop up based on where the Israelis put themselves that day. So surveillance above the ground is communicating with fighters under the ground, and they're navigating their way through and are able to come up and hit. So that is the middle camp's fierce resistance, and the Israelis pulled out yesterday. So it does seem like it was a diversionary operation to allow the Nusrat massacre to take place. Let's take a look at map B here tomorrow. I'm going to show you, if any of our audience out there is map makers, it would be great to have a simple map that had all of the locations in the Gaza Strip on it. All of the maps that we get are maps like this that basically are apartheid maps that show how the population is brutalized, to show which portions of the land is stolen. You can see that's the buffer zone all in red around there. And those innocuous arrows are 1 million plus children, 600,000 children walking 1 foot over the next from the tents that they lived in Rafah into the middle camps. But in the middle camps, it just has Deir al-Balah there, but it doesn't have Nusrat, which is a little bit further up from where Deir al-Balah is listed on that map. And it's on the other side of the main highway, the Saladin road that cuts down. So you see the Saladin road cutting Gaza in half from north to south, and then you see the Netzarim corridor cutting it from east to west and across And you can see how wide the corridor is. And so this is the purpose of the Netzarim corridor, is to carry out the raid that happened on Saturday on Nuseirat. They're able to use this corridor to access, you can see there, Gate 96. They're able to come in from Israel into this corridor protected, and well, roughly protected. We've seen the mortar strikes and many attacks on them in this corridor. But if you can see by the geography and the red blotch there, that is considered the area that the Netzarim corridor controls. And Nuseirat is just south of that red that you see there. So it's the gray marking just below the red of the Netzarim corridor. That's where Nuseirat is. And so the Israelis had 3 brigades in the Netzarim corridor on the day of the invasion, 1 paratrooper battalion. And they had their Yamam special forces, and they're able to attack in the middle of Gaza, because that's to attack south to go into the middle camps, but they can do it in the north from the Netzarim corridor to attack in the heart of Gaza City. And that's the utility for Israel of this strip of land, which we know we've covered many times on the show. The strip of land was created by bulldozing people's houses and farms and destroying every living thing in that stretch of land in order to create this corridor that we saw be used on Saturday in the operation. So let's go to number 12, because this is the way that the Palestinians have defended the Netzarim corridor. This is a Saraya al-Quds operation that's showing us command and control here. And we're seeing a commander we see 2 commanders talking. He says, "We will use the sniping and mortar units at the same time. Our fighter will determine the appropriate place to set up. At that time, he will coordinate with the brothers in the mortar unit." And then he says to Majid, call the unit and inform them about the communique, because they have a closed line system. So Majid hops on the phone, calls the fighter out in the field who's surveilling the area, who also has a camera. So you can see that when they give us camera footage, you know that that's a military position. And 𝐓𝐡𝐞 did that again yesterday, brutal footage on Al Jazeera Arabic, where surveillance footage from 𝐓𝐡𝐞 was shown Israelis carrying out massacres along the coastal road. And you see here the Al-Ghul, or the Sayed 50 cal sniper rifle that Islamic Jihad is using here. And so it's a coordinated operation. It's a complex operation that the fighters will let it go around one more time. But here we see them firing on the Israeli position with an armor-piercing round. And then in the planning, Saraya al-Quds knew the route that the Israelis would take to come and get those soldiers. So there's homemade mortar bombs made in Gaza that Saraya al-Quds is using here. And we're going to see 6 mortar teams coordinated from Majid's phone call from the command center, and dispatch these 6 guys to be ready to hit the Israeli unit that comes in to reinforce the unit that got hit by the sniper shot. So let's do it one more time tomorrow, and I'll try to get the reading at this. So first of all, you can see the photos on the wall there. That's the photos of the area that they're going to hit. And then down in front of them, they have satellite imagery and drone imagery that they're looking through. Majid's over there on the computer working on something. And they say, "We will use the sniping and mortar units at the same time." The second fighter says, "Here, the fighter will determine the appropriate place to set up. At the same time, he will coordinate with the brothers in the mortar unit." Then he says, "Majid, call the unit and inform them of the communique." And they do on their closed line. And the Israelis are all over Gaza, and they have been for 8 months. And the Israelis haven't cracked the ability for these guys to get on the phone and call each other on a closed line that 𝐓𝐡𝐞 and Saraya al-Quds defended many times in invasions that the Israelis attempted to get in and put lines on and put devices to get these lines intercepted. And we see 9 months into this war that is not happening. Beside him on the phone there, Majid had an M2 grenade beside him that's also built by 𝐓𝐡𝐞 and Saraya al-Quds. And you can see this sniper. See, his whole barrel is inside the window. He's not flagging it outside the window like the Israeli soldier that gave up his entire unit to a thermobaric warhead attack by dangling gun out the window and shooting into the distance like we see in their propaganda videos. So he's attaching the fuses to the 60 millimeter mortar. These are the small mortars, but you can tell when they fit in their hands, the 60 millimeters. I think they're actually technically 61. And that's a heavy 120 millimeter that he's launching. So they have multiple mortars that they're launching in this attack. And this attack is on video, but there's field reports in the dozens from the last week. All of this footage is, again, people, this is all from the last week since you last saw me. All this footage is still all from this week. And so just wanted to get that mortar team in because they're hitting the Netzarim corridor constantly. And the Israelis, if they intend to stay in this corridor, are going to be hit constantly in this corridor. Let's go a little further north to Jabalia camp. There was a video that Qassam released from the Battle of Jabalia. We can see two soldiers here outside of their two tank crew outside of their tank. That's a separate tank than the tank that's hit. You could see that that's that they're in a Mark IV, and I believe that's a Mark III, and the guys aren't outside of them. So if YouTube is looking at this and saying like, those are the same guys, it's not the same guys. They're different guys in the tanks there. You can see the different tank as well. But that tank is hit from basically the closest building that they could get to. And this is a video that's left over from the Battle of Jabalia, which is interesting because I said on the show last week that we get this sometimes. Sometimes fighters are cut off. They're cut off from their tunnels. Maybe they're trapped in their tunnel and they have to dig out of their tunnel. But you can see in the field reports that the fighters report sometimes back to their base days later. And they say that in the reports when the fighters return to their base, that they filed the report of what they did. And literally they're giving the helmet cam, they're giving the GoPro camera to the media department because, and we'll see these stories. Al Jazeera will do these stories. They did one in the 2014 war about a unit got trapped in the 2014 war in the tunnels, and they were trapped in there for something like 20 days. And they literally dug themselves out by hand. And the Qassam brigades thought the fighters were gone, and the fighters showed up, and it was like obviously a totally heroic story from the 2014 war that those guys were able to dig themselves out of the tunnel. Sometimes it's not as dramatic as that. There's reasons why a unit that's in one area of the camp wouldn't be able to travel to the other area of the camp and give their media in. But that's an example of that, because obviously they would have shown us that video at the time. It's dated 25 May. So they would have shown us that video at the time if their fighters had made it back to the base in time for last week's show. Okay, so this is going to be a long one, but this is Al Jazeera extended footage from Beit Hanoun, and thanks to Big Brother on Twitter, he did the translation and transcription of this, which is always very helpful, and it's great that there's a cadre of people that do that. Because getting this Arabic content into English is very helpful for obviously a significant portion of the audience, including myself. So thanks for doing that, Big Brother. So this is something this is an operation I covered. We covered this in detail a couple weeks ago on the show. And this operation, we believed it was this 2-stage ambush that involved IEDs and against the foot force, and then EFPs against the armor, the Shawaz against the armor. So we're seeing here the armor show up, and you can see the soldiers dismounted and looking in here. So people will remember this from a few shows ago. And so this is footage from Qassam, extended footage, fighters explaining the operation. And when we go back through it again, I'll read exactly what the fighters say. But when we saw this operation, it came out in the field reports first as a sniper hit. And it was the sniper video that you can go to my Twitter and see, where Qassam killed 2 IDF soldiers with one single shot from the Al-Ghul. And then they reload. The spotter says to reload, and the shooter reloads and hits the 3rd soldier. So they killed 3 soldiers with 2 bullets in this operation. And And that's what we're seeing. This here is extended footage of that, showing that 𝐓𝐡𝐞 is identifying here that they're identifying who are the officers, who are the leaders of the operation. And they're doing that by seeing who's on the binoculars, who's giving orders to who's following, who seems like they're following orders. And so this operation, there's the sniper hits with some slick editing. And those, so that video was published on one day. And then the next day, they published the rest of the video that showed that it was a two-part ambush, that the first part of the ambush was against the foot force, and then they predicted the route of the incoming force, the reinforcements, and then they blew it up. And here's the third phase that we're seeing, which is footage we never saw before. We didn't know there was a third stage. This third stage is wiring the tunnel entrance that those guys, Israeli soldiers, were coming for in the first place. And wiring up, and this is some night vision or thermal view of the Israeli soldiers moving into position that wasn't in the original video. This is all new video that 𝐓𝐡𝐞 has given to Al Jazeera, and this is one of the many reasons, but one of the reasons why Israel smashed all their gear and took the phones from their fighters. You can see again a commander leading the operation from a secondary location. No indication that command and control is being dismantled in any way based on the 𝐓𝐴 𝐄𝐿 videos, based on these complex operations that clearly are taking place with planning and with leadership and command and control all the way through the operation. So that's something. When we go through, I'll read the text for people who didn't get a chance to see it. At the end of the video here, they're going to show the destruction in Beit Hanoun, because we need to remember that Beit Hanoun was the first place that the IDF invaded on the 27th of October, and it was basically completely destroyed. Israel said that they had absolute operational control over it in early. They started saying it in late November, even when there was a 10-day prisoner exchange pause. But look at the destruction in this footage of Beit Hanoun. This is what Beit Hanoun looks like. This is what the Israelis did to Beit Hanoun. And every single time they go back, even to the edges, they get hit. So just another example, just that destruction is just unbelievable in there. So let's do it again, and I'll read you here. Beit Hanoun is separated from the far north of the Gaza Strip, just a few hundred meters separating the heart of the city and the border fence. You can see it up there in the top. Today, the Al-Qassam brigades revealed to Al Jazeera more details about the complex operation that was carried out earlier that day that lasted 26 hours. We thought it was a 6-hour operation when they reported on it. The operation began at dawn on Tuesday when 𝐓𝐡𝐞 fighters observed Israeli special forces and fighters from the Netzah Yehuda brigade advancing into the area of the agricultural school, which is north. And the fighter says here, the 𝐓𝐡𝐞 fighter says, the enemy forces advanced under our watch from the northern and eastern axis of Beit Hanoun early Tuesday, and we tracked them as they advanced towards the city, following the route that we anticipated. The first part of the operation is anti-personnel explosives set against troops that were dismounted here and inspecting the tunnel entrance. You can see it go off. They also threw hand grenades. There you can see that. The 𝐓𝐡𝐞 commander is going to come on and say, the rescue force was called to the location at night, and as they attempted, so that it started in the day. At night, a rescue force was called, and they attempted to rescue the initial force, and they were hit with the Shawad EFP against their reinforcements, against their armored vehicles. In these photos here, we're seeing Israeli soldiers picking up the pieces, the belongings, the pieces of the first ambush and the sniper hits, because the sniper hits took place before this. And so 𝐓𝐡𝐞 is, again, what I said in the first time around. They're picking out the leadership because they have extended footage. They're only showing us edited footage when they show these videos, but they've occasionally released videos to Al Jazeera, like we're seeing here, that shows the surveillance footage, which explains why it is that the officer in charge of the mission was identified, and the two fighters targeted him and his squad in a unique sniping operation where two soldiers were hit with one shot followed by a third killing him. And he says, and there's more to tell, because that's not the end of the operation. So on the day of the operation, on the day that they reported it as a 6-hour operation. It's actually a 26-hour operation. And they call it a 3-part ambush, but it's actually more like a 5 or 6-part ambush. The 𝐓𝐡𝐞 commander says to Al Jazeera, "We anticipated the arrival of the forces to the tunnel opening we used to execute the ambush. So the fighters wired up the tunnel entrance." And you can see them here literally wiring up the tunnel entrance. That's the Radia unidirectional explosive. So they put that in the doorway and it blasts not in a circle, it blasts straight ahead. So that is, again, using appropriate weapons. And we're watching them. This is the surveillance footage that we never see in their edited videos. They never show us this, but there's obviously hours of this kind of footage that the fighters have. And that's when they say we sniped an officer. When it says that in the field report, you're getting a clue here as to how they do that. And you can see them on the phone again. They're on the closed line communicating with the tunnel. Al Jazeera said that there's a robot that came into the tunnel, and the tunnel is detonated. And the force, I think they claimed 3 Yahalom soldiers were killed in that operation. This says, shortly after this, all the forces were evacuated from the advance axis and withdrew into our occupied land. So he calls them withdrawing into the envelope, into our occupied lands. That's what the 𝐓𝐡𝐞 commander says appropriately about the Gaza envelope, which is the area where all of these guys' families come from. They're all from there. And there's an interview with fighters back that has Abu Ubaidah back from 2014. And they ask where he lives. And he says the village that he lives in, Majid Ashkelon. He doesn't say where in Gaza he lives. He says the place in Palestine that he lives. And that's what many people do. And that was what I was saying about Rafah camp, that they name the neighborhood after the village that they left from. And in many cases, they organize the village around the way the village was organized in their original village. So complex ambush in Beit Hanoun in the very northeast of Gaza. We started in the very southwest in the corner along the Egyptian border. And so that is the resistance report for this week. We covered the entire Gaza Strip, and that is just what's on video. There's, of course, dozens of operations every day in the field reports. And the fighting is showing no signs of degrading the fighting force, and definitely no signs of breaking the will of the fighters or the people in Gaza, because every time we talk about the fighters, I always want to bring in the fact that the people are struggling in Gaza as well, and the fighters are always pointing that out, and it's always visible to anybody watching our program. Nora does a great job of adding in the resilience that Palestinians are struggling under, and the way that they're fighting by resisting this genocide, by not submitting. And that is why 𝐓𝐡𝐞 is not giving in on prisoner exchange demands or giving up the righteous humanitarian necessities that are needed by the people of Gaza, just in order to get a ceasefire under Israeli terms. The population is resilient, and they don't want that. They want a stop to the war, of course, and so does 𝐓𝐡𝐞. 𝐓𝐡𝐞 says that. But they're ready for a war of attrition because they're not going to give in. They're not going to surrender to Israel. Not the people, not the kids, and certainly not the fighters either. So that is the resistance report for day 250 of this war. So
incredible. Thank you so much, Jon. Yeah, sometimes I don't even know what to say. That was
they're inspiring. It's inspiring.
Yeah.
And the technical, the skill, the preparation, the fact that it's all built in Gaza, the fact that they're using these tunnels so effectively. And you saw that with the invasion of the middle camp. That's the first time they go into that area east of Deir al-Balah, and bam, they hit tunnels the tunnels are being used in sophisticated ways, and they're using in ways that those tunnels weren't exposed. They used those tunnels, they pulled back the olive branches over top of the tunnel, and the Israelis aren't going to go find that tunnel. So it's impressive fighting. It's something that military colleges will study for generations.
Yeah.
If we're around that long.
Right. And speaking of, I mean, you mentioned the war of attrition, how the Palestinian resistance fighters are ready for the war of attrition that Israel seems to be committed to at this point, because Israel is certainly not winning anything except more genocidal massacres. And it reminded me, we had this fantastic interview Ali and I did earlier this week with Shir Hever, the political economist. And it's gotten over almost 100,000 views in just the last 48 hours, which is amazing, because Shir talks about the war of attrition and its impact. Oh yeah, there it is. And its impact on the Israeli economy and the Israeli society itself, and how Israel is just leading its people, its economy, its whatever social fabric it ever had in the first place, leading it into complete collapse. And just a really fascinating look at and this is all because of Palestinian resistance, the dignity, the perseverance and the steadfastness of Palestinian resistance, which has always been legitimate and has always been focused on there we go, those are Shir's books that Asa is holding up, which has always been focused on fighting this Israeli settler colonial project. And so I want to just encourage everyone to go watch and listen to that interview with Shir Hever. I think it's really important to provide some more context.
Yeah, I agree. It was a great discussion, and we've been wanting to have Shir Hever on for a while because he's so knowledgeable as someone who was born in Israel. He's now
he's renounced his Israeli.
Yeah, he lives in Germany, but he has deep insight. He's the author of 2 books that Nora showed, and when you watch Jon's analysis today, but every week, and you put it next to the kind of political, economical analysis that Shir provides, you can really understand that Israel is in trouble. It's in dire straits, and that's good news. Shir says it's good news, which of course we agree with. We want this entity that is doing so much harm, so much evil, to no longer have the means and capacity to do that.
Right.
And I think just reflecting on what Jon showed us today is, I just imagine you are as part of the general staff in Israel, or one of the Pentagon advisors of the Israelis, and you are looking at these videos and seeing that after 8 months of trying everything, these guys, sometimes barefoot, are still popping out of the tunnels and destroying these state-of-the-art Israeli tanks, and there's nothing you can do about it. And remember, Israel has multiple motives for the genocide. One of them is sheer hatred. They hate Palestinians and want to destroy them. But there is also a tactical motive, in the sense that they believe, it's the Dahya doctrine, that making civilians suffer will sap the will of the resistance to fight, by killing their families, by destroying their homes, by murdering their loved ones. And it hasn't worked. None of it has worked. And that is just unbelievable and incredible. And I don't know, we know that Palestinians have the will. They've had the will over a century to continue to resist, no matter how isolated they are. And there are periods when nobody was supporting them. But who would have, well, John would have predicted this 8 months ago. He did. But I think, for a lot of us, you have to see it to believe it. And it is just incredible.
Yeah.
Yeah, this couldn't have happened unless Gaza built their own weapons. It's not like some way of saying like they built some of them, they have a few of them, and they're trying to spin it that they have. There's no way you can import the weapons to sustain 8 months of ground war like this and still feel confident enough to say publicly, like Abu Ubaidah says, that they're ready for a war of attrition. And so the building these weapons in Gaza is the core part of how this has been possible to happen. And that's one of the parts that at the beginning, I'm not sure that I did say, I don't know if I would have said they could fight 9 months of ground war. I think I'm surprised by the length of this war. I thought Israel, I thought they would care at least elementary care for their civilians, and that there would be multiple prisoner exchanges to get their civilians out at least. But I thought there would be breaks in this fighting that haven't happened. It's been a consistent battle, and there's nobody. They go into Rafah. Those guys in Rafah had been waiting for 7 months in their tunnels, preparing, ready to fight. And then they show up, and it's the same in the middle camps. They show up in that area of the middle camps that they hadn't been in before. And they're immediately, there's 7 videos for our show, just from that few hours of the Israelis trying to pull fighters. That was what they said they did. They said they were pulling fighters from Nusrat down. And so it looked like that wasn't the best idea because their tanks got smoked in those 2 days.
John?
Go ahead.
Yeah, on the Nusayrat attack, the massacre, John, I want to ask you this. I think it's a question on many people's minds. The reports about the use of the American-built pier and American involvement. You were on you did the situation report with Justin Poder, an excellent regular channel over at the Anti-Empire Project. That's Justin Poder's channel. You had some comments or initial thoughts about that. So I don't know if you want to just summarize them or elaborate on any other thoughts you've had about this.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think there was some talk about the pier itself being used for the operation, and I think that that's unlikely. But it's clear that they used the pier area. There's video of the medevac helicopter that took the first captive back to Israel is literally basically on the pier. And so it's clear that was used, and it's clear they used a civilian vehicle. We saw the box truck that was being escorted by armored vehicles. That is a civilian box truck, and that's something that Israel does. They actually did it yesterday in Jenin.
Right.
They got into Jenin to carry out the massacre yesterday, where they killed 6 people in a village just outside of Jenin. So that's standard criminality from the Israelis to use civilian vehicles like that. I think the idea that they rolled off the pier, I think, is the part that I don't think makes sense. They wouldn't put armored vehicles on the pier. It's a very watched pier. Rolling off the armored vehicles is, most importantly, it's tactically not necessary. They can bring in, if Americans were participated in this operation, they would bring them in armored vehicles through the Netzarim corridor from Israel. That's how they would insert them. They don't need to use the pier to do that. So I don't think it's likely that the pier itself was used, but it's clear that the area was used for the operation. And then the most important part of the American involvement is, even if they weren't in the fighting force that massacred people in the refugee camp, they have a fusion cell that is Israeli and American military and intelligence forces, operatives working round the clock in Israel. I got the quote here from the ex-Special Operations Command chief, and he called it probably the largest intelligence operation ever. And it's completely integrated with each other. They have 6 American Reaper drones that are flying constantly over Gaza, getting signals intelligence that the Israelis can't get. Intelligence creation, intelligence collection, logistics, planning. Israel said they planned this operation for weeks. And so the Americans were at least deeply involved in the planning, training. Israel said they built a building, constructed a temporary building that looked like the building that they were going to raid. The Americans are all deeply integrated in that process, and it's just so much more criminal when you take that into consideration, that Israel trained for that mission for 3 weeks, and then go in there, and the result of it is to shoot 70 children at point blank range, to walk floor to floor in an apartment building, shooting every civilian that they see. It's unbelievable, even after these 9 months, that they can shock us with the horror. This is one of the worst massacres in Palestinian history.
Yeah.
It's an unbelievable atrocity. And the Americans immediately took credit. That was the thing. The Americans took credit for it. They said they were a part of it. They said it was a daring and successful operation.
They congratulated themselves.
And then we see footage of the helicopter landing on the pier. So it makes perfect sense that people would wonder what's going on there. And I don't think that is evidence for them using the pier. I think it's evidence for them using the pier in Netzarim corridor, which is the product of genocide. It's the product of genocide. They killed every living thing, human and plant, house, buildings, everything. They flattened it, totally destroyed it, to create a military highway that allows them to insert their troops into the heart of Gaza. And I think that's what we see. They don't bring the armored vehicles down on the pier. That doesn't work. They bring the armored vehicles that are stationed at the bases inside Gaza in the Netzarim corridor. So the corridor is actually the problem.
And just to remember that one of the Israeli military bases in the Netzarim corridor is the Turkish-Palestinian Friendship Hospital, the only dedicated cancer hospital in Gaza, which Israel raided, attacked, and turned into a military base in the Netzarim corridor. And so thank you for that, John, because you see a lot of things circulating. We don't want to contribute to unconfirmed information. And the bigger point, and the more important point, is that the Americans are deeply involved and intertwined in this genocide at every level.
Every conceivable, virtually any way you can imagine, they are deeply, deeply implicated. And we don't have evidence that they did not use the pier. I'm just saying that tactically it doesn't. The necessity of doing that isn't there, because you'd have to load the tanks from elsewhere in Israel and bring them on a boat. It just doesn't make any sense.
And the bigger point, again, just to hammer this, whether or not the Americans used the pier or the Israelis used the pier, and whether or not there were actual American combatants on the ground, which nobody has confirmed, the US is still fully involved and complicit in this. And so we don't need to look for those details in order to reach that conclusion. And I think that's an important point.
I mean, if the dock floated away, the Netzarim corridor would still be an avenue for massacres. And that's the point. The Netzarim corridor has to be pulled up. It has to be removed. That's why they're debating over the wording of withdrawal. Because Israel's trying to say that the Netzarim corridor doesn't count as a populated area because they genocided the population that was there. And so they say it's not a populated area. And so that's why Qassam is saying in the negotiations that you have a total withdrawal of Israeli forces, because you don't get to keep the Netzarim corridor from losing a war. And so they're sticking to that because the Netzarim corridor is what allows tanks to come. And if American soldiers want to invade Gaza, they'll come in through the Netzarim corridor, not through the pier. They'll come through the Netzarim corridor like the Israeli soldiers do in the armored vehicles. There's 3 brigades of Israeli troops in the Netzarim corridor with all of their armored vehicles. So the real part of the story is that they use the Netzarim corridor to carry out one of the largest massacres and one of the just most appalling massacres, to kill children in the middle of the day, knowing that they would be there in the middle of the day in the streets. It's the kids that are in the streets getting stuff for their parents. They're playing in the streets, and it's just wildly disproportionate numbers of children that were killed and injured in this attack, and it happens because the Israelis are able to use the corridor to jump off and insert their troops into the heart of Gaza. It can't be defended. If the corridor wasn't there, they would have had to drive from the border, and the resistance could see them and defend the territory against the massacre, which incidentally the resistance did at the end. The Israelis, the second unit that was extracting the 3 soldiers that were held in the other building, they got pinned down by fire and engine kills. The Israelis said they had transmission trouble on 2 of their vehicles. Like, it's one too many vehicles to have fluky transmission trouble. Their engine kills because the fighters came up and hit them because they had a chance to respond after that time. And that's the danger of the Netzarim corridor, is that you can insert your troops very quickly into the heart of Gaza and carry out massacres. And that's why the corridor is under fire all the time. And that's the thing that I think we need to keep our focus on. There's lots of ways the Americans participate in this war that there's plenty of evidence for. And there's plenty of evidence that they were deeply implicated in everything that happened in the Nuseirat massacre, and they're proud of it. They talk about it. That's what they call their support for Israel and their sharing of police officers. The unit that carried out the raid, the Yamam unit, is a border police unit within the IDF, which has combat veteran soldiers that become police officers. And they're like Delta Force. They're like SEAL Team 6 in the United States. They're their highest trained rescue force. And if you do any reading about them, the Americans are all over them. This is the unit that the New York police chief goes over to Israel and gets a tour of Yamam, and they're like, we need a Yamam unit. So the Americans and Israelis are so deeply entwined. There's more than 20,000 Americans in the IDF alone. So the raiders of Nuseirat could have been Americans without them being American armed forces. They are American Israelis carrying out the raid. So, and it's difficult to know. The witness testimonies. It's difficult for people to know, and their experience as victims of the massacre is the story. Details that they can't know are the story that they told is the accurate story, that they witnessed this raid that will go down in history as like I said, is one of the most appalling massacres in a 75-year history of massacres.
Yeah. Just that, just again, but before we wrap, the level, like when you think about it, when it was, as you said, John, it was at 11 o'clock in the morning, and there's all these drones buzzing 24 hours a day, right? Even before the genocide, there's drones buzzing around, these surveillance drones, assisted, as the U.S. admits to proudly, by U.S. signals intelligence drones as well. And so they knew that at that moment that they were going to plan the raid, that the streets, this market, one of the only last remaining markets in Gaza, where there are thousands and thousands and thousands of displaced people, mostly families, all these young children. They saw the faces of these children in the drone footage as they were planning to carry out this massacre. it just just when you think about it on just a
the level of detail is horrifying.
It's deranged. Horrifying. Yeah, completely. And that was, I mean, I think all of us here at the Electronic Intifada, and also, just our colleagues in Gaza and around the world, were watching this unfold on Saturday and just in absolute shock and horror. It was horrific. It was absolutely horrific. So anyway, I know there will be a lot more to say about that and this war of attrition. So thank you so much for staying on top of that, John.
One point about the Yamam is that they were the border police unit that John mentioned that was involved in this massacre. And the rescue of these four Israeli captives, it's been reported that another 3 of them were actually killed by so-called friendly fire, and it was the Yamam who was involved in the massacre in Kibbutz Be'eri
it was
and all the massacres in the West Bank too. They're basically a death squad.
Yeah, and it was
to clarify, the massacre of Israelis in Kibbutz Be'eri, friendly fire. Yeah, so they've got a track record of.
And it was the resistance that announced that 3 of the Israeli captives were killed in Nusayrat. So, and 1 Israeli senior officer was killed. So 4 Israelis killed for 4 rescued. Of course, almost 300 Palestinians killed and hundreds more injured. So, I mean, it shows to any sensible or rational person, which excludes the Israeli and American leadership at this point, that the only viable way to get those Israeli prisoners of war back, if they really want them, is to end this genocide and
accept the rational terms that Hamas has been laying out since day one.
Yeah.
Anyway, thanks for that. Let's go to some of the go to some of the comments and then take a look at the front page of the Electronic Intifada. There's a lot of content that we've published in the last week.
Yeah,
obviously,
for sure. So some of our viewers from the different platforms come from, as usual, all over the world. Toronto, Florida, Turtle Island, New Jersey, Ireland, Oaxaca, Mexico, UK, Sweden, India, all over the world as always. Thank you, everybody. We had a note here from a viewer, Timothy, who says, "I'm blind and really appreciate the subtitles being read."
We're trying to do that more and more.
Yeah, absolutely. And as mentioned at the beginning, we have the instructions for the live captions, which are obviously not perfect, but they're pretty good. So that's
and
useful.
also just to mention, Asa, you said the different platforms. So just to tell people that we are now streaming this live, not just on YouTube, but on Twitter, on our account at Intifada, and on Facebook Live, and I think on Twitch. Now we've been testing it, so we haven't really announced it. We've been testing to make sure it works, but we're trying to make this available live on more and more platforms, and we're delighted to have viewers on all of those platforms.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, 100%. Some thanks to Omar, our colleague Omar, who was on the show earlier, of course. Thank you, Omar, for coming on, and we hope to have you on more often. Let's see. There's many comments here. Don't have time to go through them all, obviously, but thanks to everybody. and a viewer here says that John needs a plant.
Oh, you're muted, John.
I'm actually surrounded by plants.
Yeah.
You can't necessarily see them all, but some
know that they're there. Yeah.
Yeah. There's a lot of, as always, a lot of appreciation for the Resistance Hour, as it per se. So thank you to all our viewers and listeners, and thank you for showing up week after week, and thank you for all the likes and subscribes. As we always say, it does help with the algorithm. So thank you to everybody.
And thank you to everyone again for all the messages, all the support, all the ideas, all the suggestions. We can't always reply to them individually, but we do read them. John, in Ireland, I got your email while we were live. Thank you for your comments. I do read all the emails. I just don't always have a chance to reply to them.
Yeah,
but,
I feel the same. So thank you for saying that.
Yeah, it's important to know that we feel it, we appreciate it, and it makes a big difference to us.
It really does.
If someone can draw a map of Gaza, that would be great. If anyone's a cartographer.
What are the
it's
details you want
to find a map that has every place that you want on it, and it doesn't have like where all the checkpoints are, or how the fishing is
just a regular geographical,
just like a pencil line map is all we need. But I can't.
Why don't you, John? Why don't you put
that has Nusrat, Darabala, like they have one or the other.
Yeah.
Why don't we put a pinned comment on the EI YouTube page, and you can describe what you want, and
send it over. DM John on Twitter,
because all the maps are just all the brutality of the occupation. It's what's closed, what's not allowed, where their checkpoints are. It's brutal. They do, like, United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs does extremely detailed maps.
They're political maps. Yeah. I mean, Salman Abu Sitta probably has a really beautiful map of.
I was just looking because on my upper shelf here, I have his huge Atlas of Palestine. But it's so detailed, I'm not sure that would do.
Maybe too much detail. All right. Well, finally, let's look at the front page of the Electronic Intifada.
There's so much. Extraordinary coverage. Earlier on, when we had Omar Karmi on, our dear colleague and associate editor, a brilliant analyst in his own right. And by the way, a very funny one. His articles often contain real humor. It's hard to find humor in the current situation, but sometimes that helps relieve the stress. And he's a very funny writer. But he's also an editor, along with David and Leah and our other editors, who work directly with our writers in Gaza, who are represented in force on the front page right now, as they are every day. And I just want to point to those features there. If you scroll down a little, Tamara. By the way, that top, just before you go down, Tamara, that top piece I quoted from, that's by our colleague Maureen Murphy, about the State-Teman torture camp and just the utter horrors that are being revealed about what's going on there. But let's look at those features. And I'm going to talk about the one by David Sheen in a second. But just again, I have to make this bigger so I can read the names there. But again, our writers in Gaza, our friends, our colleagues, showing up every day in circumstances where life is barely possible, and they are writing and witnessing what is going on and telling their stories and the stories of those around them. And we're very proud. And scroll down a little. There's another piece that I think, pretty much most of these are. There's a piece by Abu Bakr, which I think, Nora, you'd also quoted from. Abu Bakr Abed, our dear friend and colleague, who we've seen on the live stream several times, writing about just the experience of people in central Gaza amid these horrifying Israeli massacres. And if we go back, then we see also Ruwaida Amer, one of our regular contributors. All of our writers in Gaza are just doing extraordinary work. And then let's just a quick word about the David Sheen piece on the top right. That's the top right feature. Now, this story is, I think, the definitive forensic piece of journalism on the invention of the burned babies atrocity tale that went around the world just after October 7th. And David Sheen shows how this lie was fabricated by a senior Israeli military officer called Colonel Golan Vach, who was at the time, he just recently has completed his service, but at the time he was the head of the Israeli army's rescue unit, and he fabricated these atrocity tales about burned babies being found, none of which was true. This is accompanied by, it's a long, I'm not going to lie to you, it's a long article. It's 10,000 words, which is probably one of the longest we've ever published. But this is for the record. This is for history, showing forensically how this was fabricated. But if you don't want to read the whole story, read some of it, or watch the accompanying video report, which you see right then. It's also on our YouTube channel. And I think 12 minutes, David walks you through how Golan Vach invented this story and told it to international media, who then repeated it. And you actually see footage of Golan Vach telling these lies. So we're very proud of this kind of investigative journalism. It's just really incredible stuff. And David Sheen did an absolutely tremendous job. He worked on this for weeks, and then we worked on it also for a long time. I'm saying that because I'm remembering how Jeffrey Gettleman claimed that his shoddy hoax article, The Screams Without Words, took months to do. Well, this is what real journalism that takes a long time to do looks like. It's an investment of time and effort and energy and expertise. So that's great stuff. And let's just go back and see if there's anything else we want to highlight on the front page.
Noor's poem. Yeah.
Yes. Oh, yeah. This is a beautiful piece by Noor Abu Shamala, and we do occasionally publish poetry, and it's just it's another way to experience the world and reflect on the world. And Nora Barrows-Friedman, who's in Gaza, wrote this beautiful poem. We're very proud to publish it. And then just our colleague David Cronin has done some great piece on, again, he really keeps an eye on the role of the European Union. He had a great piece last week on how the far-right parties across Europe who are competing in the European Parliament elections and who did very well are the closest allies of Israel, and how Israel was really pulling for them. And this is a follow-up piece on Ursula von der Leyen, the head of the European Commission. Of course, now the question is she going to get another term? Well, that's to be decided. But I doubt that if she's replaced, it will make any difference to EU policy. One sad note, by the way, I saw today that Claire Daly, the member of the European Parliament from Ireland, lost her seat. She was one of the very few voices that really spoke clearly and loudly. She'll continue to do so. I hope we can get her on. We should ask her. She's just been a fantastic voice over the past few years and will continue to be so. Mick Wallace, who's her partner in truth-telling in the European Parliament, I'm not sure if he was re-elected. I didn't see that he was defeated. It may be that some counts are still going on. I'm not sure. If you know, maybe tell us in the comments. I checked before we went live. But we also keep an eye on what's happening in Europe. And then another quick shout out, if we go back to the front page, for the interview, the conversation that Nora and I had with Shir Hever. It was just a really fascinating, insightful conversation. I can't recommend it enough. I love listening to Shir Hever. He has so much insight. And
we'll have him back on the live stream as soon as we can, because there's so much happening in terms of internal Israeli collapse, but also a lot of his work on at the Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions National Committee,
where he's helping to organize the military embargo campaign.
It's incredible. It's incredible. And so he's doing a lot of research into the military embargo campaigns, but also specifically Germany's relationship to arming and enabling.
So it was a jam-packed conversation, but we were barely able to scratch the surface of what there is to talk about. So that's enough to be going on.
It's a lot. You have a lot of content, dear audience.
And new stuff published every day. So if you want to keep up and get a daily email with all the headlines in one email where you can just quickly see everything we've published and click on it, go to the Get Updates page. And I'll show you a little trick, because people have said to me, because a lot of people look at the Electronic Intifada on their mobile phones. So if you go to the front page on the Electronic Intifada on your phone, people say, well, where is that? Where is that Get Updates link? Where is the Donate Now link? Because sometimes people want to make a donation, which we greatly appreciate. Turn the phone on its side, and there it is. Magic. So it's magic. So that's a quick way to find it. So and so thank you to everyone for all your support. Again, thank you to everyone who likes, subscribes, shares the articles, shares them with family and friends, especially the work of our reporters in Gaza. Thank you to everyone who's made a donation to fund this work, because this is work. It's hard work, and great credit to all our colleagues. We're just so indebted to everyone who gives us the support. And some people, wonderful people. You're all wonderful. But people who've signed up to become monthly donors is also an incredible gift, because that sustains the work over time. It makes it more predictable and allows us to spend less time, worrying about supporting the work, and more time doing the work. That's what we want to do, to bring you all this journalism and analysis. And we're very, very proud and happy to do it.
Indeed. Thank you so much, Ali. And thank you, as always, to Tamara Nassar behind the scenes and in our hearts. And on behalf of everyone at the Electronic Intifada, and Jon, Asa, Ali, myself, thank you all, and we'll see you next week.